Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories, hey dear friends. An ancient empire that once stretched across the known world, yet viewed intimacy not as a private affair but as a method to control, to humiliate, and to display strength. From rulers who gathered young male companions as ornamental trophies, to seasonal rites where women welcomed gentle lashes hoping for the gift of motherhood, nothing seemed too unusual. The tales you are about to drift into are not works of fantasy or fiction, but real moments etched into stone walls, painted onto everyday dishes, and noted in official records. Tonight, you will journey with me through the most honest truths left behind by the old Roman world. So, before you settle in and let your eyes grow heavy, please consider liking this video and joining our little family, but only if you truly appreciate what I create here. And let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what the clock says for you. It is always a lovely thing to see who is sharing this time from all over the earth. Now turn down the lights, perhaps set a soft fan to hum in the background, and let us begin this evening's stroll together. If we start by thinking that physical intimacy was a secret personal matter in ancient Rome, we are already lost. It was not secluded, it was not sentimental, and it was certainly not balanced. In that world, intimacy was never simply about delight. It was about order, who held power over whom, who took the lead, and who followed. That single detail told you all you needed to know about a man's place. Intimacy was a form of speech, a signal of control, and everyone was expected to understand it without confusion. For Roman men, especially those born free and of high birth, physical authority was just another branch of political and household command. They could take whatever they wished from those beneath them, and that included human bodies. A master could share his bed with his male servants, his female servants, or even youths from conquered lands without any disgrace. The question was never whether the act was rough or unwanted. It was whether the man kept his leading role. That was the only thing that counted. In other words, what it meant to be a man in Rome rested on taking charge, not on mutual agreement. They did not pull apart intimacy from control. They saw them as the very same thing. A Roman senator could lead armies and still feel deeply uneasy if someone whispered that he enjoyed the opposite role in private. That worry was not foolish in their culture. The only real dishonor was being seen as the one who yielded. Even with a servant, even with someone completely powerless, if the positions were reversed, the shame remained. What this meant was that intimacy was not something you enjoyed quietly. It was something you enacted, and others watched, others listened, others shared gossip, others judged. A man's value could rise or fall depending on who he was seen with or how it was. Rumored he acted when alone, and since intimacy was hardly ever truly alone, the danger was always present. Your rivals might send someone to watch, or even worse, make up tales that others would happily accept. Once your good name had a small crack, it did not take long for the whole image to fall apart. That is why Roman men obsessed over control, not just over others, but over themselves, their posture, their expressions. Even the way they spoke had to suggest certainty. Softness was risky. A pause could be mistaken for lack of strength. And lack of strength in Rome was not forgiven, especially when it came to intimate matters. They did not fear the act itself. They feared being seen as the one without authority. Public displays of dominance were not limited to politics or military victories. They spread into the home, the meal, the bathhouse. A man surrounded himself with people he could direct and bodies he could claim. The more he was seen taking charge, the more others respected his manhood. But it was not simply about action, it was about appearance. He did not need to do anything in front of an audience. The simple belief that he was the one in control was enough to keep his image strong. The sad truth is that so much of this was a performance. People played roles. They said what was expected. They stayed quiet when they noticed something that might challenge the accepted view. A man who preferred gentleness had to pretend to be rough. A man who felt uneasy had to laugh at rude jokes, and no one dared admit being vulnerable, because in Rome to admit weakness in intimacy was to give up your spot in the ladder, and once you slipped, there was no climbing back up. It went even deeper than that. These rules applied not only to who you shared a bed with, but also to how you managed your family. A father was supposed to keep tight control over his household. That included the intimate behavior of his wife, his daughters, and his servants. If a woman in his house was thought to be too free with her affections, it was not only her name that suffered. His honor was questioned. People asked if he had lost his grip, if he had failed to rule over what was his. The male body in Rome was not only a tool for war, but also a weapon of command. To be respected, it had to be trained. To be feared, it had to seem unreachable. And to be honored, it had to lead. Even in moments of closeness, a Roman man was still supposed to act like a general. Passion was permitted, surrender was not. The difference between the two shaped everything from personal bonds to imperial images. Statues of Roman leaders often showed them partly undressed, strong and steady, not to excite but to declare. Their bodies were signs of control, just like their military flags or their written laws. And yet those same bodies were always being watched. One quiet accusation, one message scratched on a wall, and their power could become a joke, because no amount of muscle could save a man whose private conduct was brought into question. The double standard was clear. Women were not judged by whether they led or followed. They were judged by whom they belonged to. A woman's intimacy was not her own. It was a reflection of her male guardian's status. If she behaved poorly, it meant he had failed. But for men, their own bodies were the battlefield. They had to lead constantly or face consequences that no lost battle could match. So when we talk about Roman intimacy, we are not just speaking about preferences or routines, that even a smile could be misunderstood. Of power so stiff, so deeply rooted, that even a smile could be misunderstood. Even a sigh could be unsafe. And every interaction was a show with real outcomes. That is what made Roman sexual politics more harsh than any written rule. It was not enforced by soldiers, it was enforced by everyone around you. Intimacy was not something that stayed behind closed doors. It walked with you into the public square. It sat with you It followed you into the meeting hall. The pressure to seem dominant never lifted. And those who stumbled were remembered not for what they achieved, but for what others believed they allowed. That is how rumors worked. They stuck harder than facts. There was no middle ground. You either led or you were laughed at. You either played the part or you were left behind. In Rome, being a man meant winning, even in places where no one claimed to be keeping score. And losing that image could end everything. No title, no statue, no victory could erase what others whispered about your body. That obsession shaped every rule, every habit, every worry. It was not about right and wrong. It was about survival. And that survival depended not only on whom you defeated in war, but on whom you led in private, or whom people thought you did. Next, we will see what happened when that fragile performance failed. A scandal that touched the most powerful man in Rome. A whisper that never faded. His name was Julius Caesar, and the story is just beginning. That fragile image of dominance which Roman men worked so hard to protect came with a safety net built into their world's system of servitude. Because while Roman law and custom judged a man harshly if he seemed submissive, it gave him almost unlimited freedom when it came to people below him. And no one was lower in the social order than a servant. A Roman citizen could share all the intimacy he wanted with a servant, and not a single eyebrow would lift. Not by law, not by religion, not even by gossip. There was no shame in it because in their thinking, a servant was not a real person the way a citizen was. Servants were seen as property, and using one intimately was not considered betrayal. A man's loyalty to his wife was measured not by his actions, but by whether he kept other free-born women out of his bed. A servant did not matter. That exception created a gap wide enough to hide an entire house of pleasure inside it. And it was not only men using female servants, the same rule applied to male servants too. Unless it is with someone who legally counts as a piece of furniture. Unless it is with someone who legally counts as a piece of furniture. That is how disconnected Roman ethics were from ideas of mutual agreement or emotional faithfulness. The body of a servant was an approved outlet. It did not stir jealousy, did not need explaining, and did not challenge a man's honor. It was expected, even encouraged, as part of running a household. These arrangements were not secret. They did not have to be. A wealthy Roman home might include several young boys and girls chosen not only for work but for personal service. Their presence was clear. Their role was understood. There were no hidden scandals or private meetings. Their masters claimed them openly, sometimes giving them playful names that hinted at their duties. And this was not a rare exception. It was common practice across villas, apartments, and even army camps. To the Romans, a man was only guilty of unfaithfulness if he involved a free woman or a married citizen's wife. That was the boundary. Everything below that line was allowed. And as strange as it sounds now, no one worried about the rightness of it. The concern was always status, protecting family honor. And family honor had nothing to do with how you treated people who had no legal standing. This setup allowed Roman men to live with constant contradiction. They could praise good behavior in public speeches while using half their household in private. They could campaign on the value of discipline while keeping a favorite servant boy in their personal quarters. It was not lying by Roman standards. It was simply how things worked. The system was built to protect men's reputations while giving them free access to bodies considered unworthy of defense. Women did not get this freedom. Their intimacy was guarded, watched, and restricted even inside marriage. A Roman woman accused of being with a servant could face severe results, not only social rejection but legal punishment too. She could be disowned by her father, divorced by her husband, or even killed if her family chose to treat it as a matter of deep dishonor. In contrast, if her husband took a young servant into his bed, she was expected to look away. Her silence was a form of loyalty. What is disturbing is not only the double standard, but how comfortable everyone was with it. There was no resistance, no legal change, no recorded complaints. Servants were used in this way for generations, and the practice was handed down like any other household skill. Mothers might even teach daughters how to avoid becoming jealous, how to endure the presence of other companions without protest. It was seen as part of being a Roman wife. The use of servants for intimacy was not only allowed, it was built into the system. Even in military settings, commanders were given young helpers for personal use. In the writings of Roman historians, such arrangements are described with calm normalness. These accounts do not hide or dramatize the relationships. They mention them as plainly as one might list dinner guests. And again, the point was not emotional connection. It was ownership. Some writings and poems joke about these relationships. Some are cruel, some are teasing, but almost no one questions the morality of what was happening. The concern was always whether a man was acting too fond, too soft, too attached. Those were the real dangers. Not the use of another human being, but the sense that you had forgotten your place as master. A Roman could share a bed with a dozen servants and still be admired. But if he showed too much care for one, his peers might start talking. This system blurred the lines between private want and public power. A man's household was a mirror of his rank. The more control he showed, the more respect he earned. A wife who obeyed, servants who submitted, and children who reflected his values all strengthened his standing. Intimacy was folded into this structure. It was not questioned because it was not separate. It was another form of command. It is tempting to assume that all men used their servants this way, but that was not necessarily true. Some may have stayed away. Some may have felt uncomfortable. But refusing this kind of dominance came with a price. If a man did not claim his rights, others might assume he lacked the strength to do so. In a world so focused on rank, even kindness could look like weakness. Quietness could bring suspicion, and restraint could be seen as turning away from your status. Servants, of course, had no say. They could not legally refuse. There was no idea of attack when it involved a servant. Agreement was meaningless. Some may have tried to resist, but the results were harsh. Others may have tried to survive by becoming favorites, trading physical access for better treatment. But that did not make it a choice. It made a way to live through the day. The normalization of this behavior left a deep wound in Roman culture. It spread into writing, family life, and even worship. Gods were often imagined in stories that mirrored the actions of powerful men. Jupiter himself was shown as a physical conqueror, taking what he wanted when he wanted. These myths did not challenge power. They excused it. They reinforced the idea that domination was holy and submission was natural. Looking at it now, it is hard to ignore how completely Rome tied intimacy to control. Nothing was sacred, nothing was truly private, and the cruelty was not in hidden corners. It was at the center of how society operated. What shocks us today is the structure they called order. Next, we will look at how Rome built that order even further, creating whole neighborhoods, lists, and tax rules for a practice they saw as perfectly ordinary, the selling of intimacy. But not all who sold were treated the same. And in Rome, the difference between shame and celebration could come down to a single coin and a public stage. If the intimate use of servants helped men keep control in private, Rome had another system to help manage desire in public. It was the selling of intimacy. But unlike in many other old cultures where it remained unofficial or hidden, the Roman Empire did not just tolerate this trade, it organized it, controlled it, and took taxes from it. The business of selling closeness became part of Rome's economy, its neighborhoods, and even its festivals. And once again, the purpose was never pleasure. It was control. Intimacy for sale was not treated as a shameful backstreet secret. It was written into the laws. Those who sold intimacy were required to register with local authorities. Their names, their services, even their prices could be listed in books. The state did not protect them from harm, but it made sure to collect a share of their earnings. They were both ignored and used. Their work was seen as necessary, but their dignity was erased in the process. Imagine a world where the government gives you a license to be used, but never a shield to feel safe. That was Rome. There were no health checks, no rights, no protections, only taxes and expectations. And while selling intimacy was legal, it came with a permanent social mark. A registered seller could never marry a free-born citizen. Her children were kept from respectable inheritance, and even if she left the trade, the legal mark stayed on her record. But within that world, there was structure, a ladder. Not all sellers were equal. Some worked in dark little rooms behind taverns. Others were attached to houses controlled by powerful men, and a few worked alone, charging more and choosing their clients. There were streetwalkers, bathhouse workers, party companions, and performers. Some were servants forced into it. Others were free women driven by need or circumstance. The lines between choice and force were always unclear. Roman cities had whole districts known for this trade. These were not poor areas hidden on the outskirts. They were woven into the city, near temples, along marketplaces, close to army camps. Some streets even got their names from the services offered there. At night, small lamps marked the doorways, and clients did not have to guess. Lists of services and prices were sometimes scratched into the walls. Even the wall writing joined in, teasing or praising certain workers by name. Some houses were simple stone rooms with nothing but a bed and a wall carving. Others served wealthier men with paintings, cushions, and wine. The decoration did not hide the purpose, it showed it off. Wall paintings displayed graphic scenes, offering a preview like a menu. And the more expensive the place, the more unusual the theme. Egyptian styles, Greek stories, wild animals. It was not about art, it was about fantasy. The irony was that the powerful men who spoke against public indecency often spent there. Knights paying for the same. Senators visited these places, sometimes in disguise, sometimes openly. Some even hosted their own events, hiring groups of sellers for private meals. These were not quiet gatherings. They were shows, dances, music, flowing wine, and planned acts. In some circles, hosting a wild party was seen as a sign of wealth and refinement. The women at these events were often chosen for their novelty. Some were known for their singing, others for their flexibility or unusual talents. They were not called by their real names. They had stage names, short nicknames, or simply labels. They were goods passed around, judged, praised, or dismissed. And though they stood at the center of attention, they held no real power. In writing, these women appear often, sometimes as temptresses, other times as punchlines. Poets wrote verses comparing their bodies to temples or storms, but never as people. They were ideas, not individuals. The public could admire their beauty while scorning their job. A man might boast of being with a famous courtesan but never marry her. Her status stayed fixed no matter her fame. Even the gods seemed to allow it. Venus, the goddess of love, had temples where some rituals looked like commercial intimacy. Certain festivals encouraged loosened behavior. During Saturnalia, servants and masters swapped roles and physical behavior became playful. In those moments, sellers were no longer invisible. They were put on a stage. But as soon as the celebration ended, they returned to their corners, used and then forgotten again. The written rules reinforced their status. If a seller was attacked, the penalties were lighter than if it happened to a citizen woman. If she became pregnant, her child was automatically kept from citizenship unless the father was known and approved. And if she tried to leave the trade and marry upward, the law blocked her. Once registered, always marked. Rome's tolerance of this work was never about respect. Was about boundaries, and yet within that system, some women found ways to rise. A few became so well known that their names appeared in poems and plays. They attracted wealthy clients, gathered property, and even paid for events. But even then their ceiling was low. No matter how clever or rich they became, they could never cross the final line. They could entertain the ruling class, but they could never join it. Looking at Rome's approach to selling intimacy, what stands out most is how organized the exploitation was. There was no pretending, no moral excuse, just structure. It was a machine, and every part of it fed the power of men. The women were necessary but disposable, celebrated but never safe, and their existence helped reinforce the idea that power meant access, that control over bodies was the natural right of those who ruled. What shocks us is not that this trade existed. It is that it was turned into policy, that it was tracked, taxed, and mapped like any other city. Rome did not hide this part of itself. It accepted it, wove it into buildings, laws, and daily life. And for Roman men, paying for intimacy was not a weakness. It was a privilege. Next, we will go deeper into that privilege to a holiday where rules disappeared, straps replaced flowers, and intimacy became a sacred ritual, a celebration so wild it made the gods blush. Welcome to the Lupercalia. If Rome could turn intimacy into law, it could just as easily turn it into religion, and few festivals captured that strange mix of faith and flesh better than Lupercalia. Every year in the middle of February, the city let go of its usual limits. Rules were relaxed, roles were swapped, and beneath the surface of celebration, something far more basic was on display. This was not just a party. It was a rite with centuries of tradition, animal blood, and public undress. The Romans called it sacred. Outsiders would have called it chaos. The event began with priests known as Luperci, sacrificing goats and a dog in the Lupercal Cave, the legendary birthplace of Rome's founders, Romulus and Remus. From the skins of those animals they cut thin leather strips called februa. Then, almost immediately, the real show started. The priests, naked or nearly so, ran through the streets of the Palatine Hill, gently striking women with the strips. And the women did not run away. They lined up willingly because in the Roman mind being hit by goat hide straps was believed to help fertility and ease childbirth. Nothing says romance like being tapped with freshly skinned goat leather in the name of divine approval. But this was not treated as strange. It was celebrated. The crowd cheered. Wine flowed freely. The laughter was loud, and the rules of modesty were set aside for a day. Even high-born women, normally wrapped in layers of silk and formality, would take part. Being struck by a Lupercus was a lucky charm, not an embarrassment. The atmosphere was unlike anything else in the Roman calendar. There were no formal speeches, no carefully planned processions, just a wave of bodies, sweat, wine, and tradition moving through the city like a living current. The line between priest and partygoer blurred quickly. And that was the point. The sacred was not supposed to feel clean or orderly. It was meant to be raw. The Romans believed that the body could be a container for divine energy, especially when stirred by fear, pleasure, or pain. The link to intimacy was never directly spoken but always understood. Lupercalia honored fertility in all its forms. Women were blessed through strikes. Men proved their strength by running, shouting, and showing themselves without shame. And behind the rituals, parties took shape. Small gatherings turned into drinking games. Private corners turned into public displays. The energy did not return to normal when the sun went down. It only grew. The government, far from banning the event, supported it. Even as Rome became more organized, more rule-bound, Lupercalia remained untouchable for centuries. It was a cultural release valve, a time to give in to impulses that were normally hidden. And because it was framed as a religious rite, almost nothing was off-limits. If a senator joined in the striking, people laughed. If a general got drunk and kissed a stranger in public, it became a story, not a scandal. The deeper reason this festival lasted so long was its mythical weight. It was rooted in the origin story of Rome itself. The wolf who nursed Romulus and Remus stood for wildness, instinct, and survival. Lupercalia was a tribute to that wolf spirit, to the idea that civilization needed moments of release. And if that release looked like a rush of half-naked men chasing women with boot-skin straps, so be it. It is hard not to notice that the same culture that preached order and goodness made space for a yearly riot in the name of the gods. Roman discipline was always balanced by Roman indulgence. Their leaders spoke of restraint while quietly funding the chaos. The contradiction was not hidden, it was accepted. One day of madness helped preserve 12 months of control. That was the logic. And yet, as the empire shifted, so did its tolerance for older pagan customs. By the time Christianity spread through the ruling class, Lupercalia began to feel less like religion and more like wrongdoing. Church leaders condemned it. They saw the undress, the drunkenness, the sexual energy, and labeled it a danger to Christian goodness. There were efforts to reshape the festival, to replace it with saints and symbols, but old habits die slowly. The last recorded Lupercalia took place in the late 5th century under the rule of Pope Gelasius, who called the practice indecent and unfit for a Christian city. And though some Romans resisted, the tide had turned. 1,000 years of tradition ended not with a riot, but with a written order. Straps were hung up, temples were given new purposes, and the wild energy that once moved through the city every February was folded into something tamer. What remained was memory, and some believe echoes of Lupercalia lived on in later customs. Valentine's Day, with its arrows, hearts, and rituals of courtship, has been loosely linked to the older festival. But whatever resemblance exists is faint compared to the original. The real Lupercalia was not about cards or chocolates. It was about fertility, force, and a thin veil between human and animal. It also showed something uncomfortable about Roman values, that even religion, the thing most societies use to calm passion, was used here to set it free. The gods did not demand quiet prayer. They demanded proof of strength, of virility, of courage to step outside normal roles. Lupercalia gave Roman men the stage to perform that proof, and women, willingly or not, played their part too. What makes it unsettling is how joyfully it was done. There was no fear, no guilt, only cheers and celebration. The streets of the greatest empire, people showed their devotion not through silence and kneeling, but through flesh and noise. They believed this pleased the divine. And maybe for a while it did. But as Rome changed, the festival's survival became impossible. A new god now ruled the empire, one who demanded humility over show, modesty over excess. And in that world, Lupercalia no longer had a place. Next, we will turn from public rituals to private rooms, where what started as a toast could end in a room full of bodies. Roman meals were never just about food. They were feasts of power, pride, and pleasure. And the more important the guest list, the more rich the night became. Lupercalia may have disappeared from the calendar, but its spirit never fully left Roman culture. If the streets no longer allowed for public rituals of excess, the private homes stepped in to replace them. And in no setting was that more visible than in the elite Roman dinner party. These gatherings started with food and compliments, but rarely ended there. For the ruling class, a dinner party was not only about hospitality. It was a performance, a chance to show wealth, status, and physical access all in one rich evening. The guests were chosen carefully, powerful men, rising politicians, artists, poets, and sometimes their companions or favorites. The atmosphere grew looser with every cup of wine. At first the talk stayed political or thoughtful, but the later the hour, the more personal everything became. Jokes sharpened, hands wandered, bodies shifted closer. The servants knew the signs. They dimmed the lights, poured stronger wine, and made room for what came next. A Roman dinner without intimacy was like a theater with no actors, empty, strange, and missing the point. These evenings often ended in shared acts that blurred the lines between host and guest, pleasure and power. Servants were expected to join in. Sellers were brought in ahead of time, waiting in side rooms or even already present at the table. Gender did not matter. Neither did age, as long as everyone played their part in the host's show of excess. There were no rules except one: the host had to be in control. These were not free gatherings in the modern sense of shared abandon. They were carefully planned shows where ranks stayed clear. The host began. The guests followed. Those who waited risked seeming stiff or worse, disloyal. A guest who pulled away too early might find himself left out of future gatherings. And in Rome, losing access to these circles could mean losing everything. For the servants and sellers, it was simply another part of their work. They were passed between guests without pause. Some were praised for their beauty or skill. Others were laughed at, pushed aside, and called back later if someone changed their mind. There was no privacy, no dignity, only the rhythm of pleasure and display. What mattered was the mood, the pace, the sense that something unusual, something Roman was happening. These dinners often included musicians, poets, and dancers. But eventually the entertainment turned physical. It became a challenge. Who could last the longest? Who could shock the room? Who could attract the most partners in one night? Stories of legendary parties traveled for years. Senators who boasted of being with 3 servants in a row. Generals who laughed as they shared companions with their subordinates. These were not secrets, they were trophies. It is disturbing how often the line between celebration and use was not just crossed, but completely erased. There was no thought of agreement from the lower classes. Their presence was assumed, their participation was required, and their pain, if noticed, was treated as part of the experience. A powerful man could joke about breaking a wine cup in bed, but never mentioned the bruises on the boy beneath him. The shape of these events was mirrored in Roman values. Excess was not a flaw, it was a sign of success. To host a boring dinner was a social failure. To host a memorable one, even if it ended in chaos, secured your name. Men competed for influence through these displays, and women, if present, often played decorative roles or joined in to raise their husband's standing. Some parties were themed: Greek nights with robes and lyres, Egyptian feasts with dancers and gold masks, mythical reenactments where guests acted out scenes of attraction and victory. The more creative the host, the more memorable the night. But beneath the costumes and music, the same rule remained. Power shone through appetite, and appetite measured by how much you could take and command. These events became so legendary that some thinkers condemned them. Seneca wrote about the corruption of Roman youth, blaming the dinner halls more than the battlefields. Others described the evenings with reluctant wonder, acknowledging the brilliance of the host, even as they winced at the aftermath. But rarely did anyone speak for the ones used. Their names did not survive, only their function. For those who lived to serve at these tables, the nights blended into each other. Pleasure for some meant exhaustion for others. There are records of servants collapsing from overwork, of women crying quietly in corners while laughter roared around them. But no law stopped it, no authority stepped in. It was, after all, private property, and in Rome a man's home was his empire. What fascinates now is how normal it was. These were not secret meetings in shadowy villas. They were part of high social life. Children born from these evenings were sometimes raised openly. Others were left behind or sent away. But the dinners continued year after year, generation after generation, as if the empire itself depended on proving that no desire was too great and no limit too sacred. It is hard not to feel that Roman pride was built as much on cruelty as it was on victory. They conquered lands and people, but also bodies and silence, and they celebrated that conquest not only with statues and triumphs but with long nights where nothing was off limits and no one was safe. Next, we leave the dinner hall and enter the walls of their homes and bathhouses, where even the building design tells a story. Because in Rome, intimacy was not hidden in bedrooms. It was carved into the walls, painted beside the bed, and honored in temples. Welcome to the art of control. If Roman dinners were places to act out physical power, Roman walls were places to display it. You did not need to attend a feast to know what Rome valued. You only had to look around. The erotic was not hidden in secret corners. It was carved into columns, painted across bedrooms, and scratched onto public walls. The city was a gallery of desire. But more than that, it was a gallery of control, dominance, and everything that lay beneath the surface of Roman discipline. Walk through the ruins of Pompeii and Herculaneum, and the first thing you will notice is how unshy the art is. Bedrooms with paintings of couples in every pose, hallways with wall paintings of group intimacy. Even bakeries and taverns featured carvings of large erect phalluses surrounded by symbols of luck. These were not jokes, they were reminders. Power was measured not only in money or weapons but also in virility. The male body, always erect, always victorious, was everywhere. In Rome, even the kitchen wall might encourage you with a giant stone phallus and a wink. Public toilets had erotic wall writing. Bathhouses had ceiling paintings showing scenes of physical conquest. And homes, no matter how elegant, often included art that would make today's museums pause. It was not considered shocking. It was considered Roman. The phallus was especially sacred. Called the fascinum, it was not only decoration, it was protection. Romans believed that images of the penis could keep away evil. They placed them above doorways, in children's rooms, even around their necks as charms. Some were small and subtle, others were bold with wings or eyes or even legs. The message was clear. Physical power was not shameful. It was magical, holy even. But the images were not only of male-female pairs. Roman art included same-sex couples, both male and female, often shown in ways that reinforced the idea of rank. The leading partner was shown as ideal. The following partner was often drawn as lower in status. Group intimacy was also common in wall art, especially in houses of pleasure, where the images acted as both a menu and a guide. What today would be called pornography was for them a kind of cultural wallpaper. Some of the most detailed erotic art has been found in the country villas of the wealthy. These were not public taverns. They were private getaways, and still the walls were filled with scenes that mixed mythology and intimacy. Zeus seducing mortals, satyrs chasing nymphs, gods changing into animals to fulfill their wishes. These stories were known by everyone. Excused human behavior by pointing to the divine. If Jupiter could wander, so could you. Children were not shielded from these images. They grew up surrounded by them. Reading wall writing that also described someone's latest bedroom adventure. There were no censorship laws, no separation between art and anatomy. The purpose of the images was often as physical as the acts they showed. What is incredible is how much of it survived even after volcanic ash buried whole cities. The walls kept speaking. Digs in the 18th and 19th centuries uncovered hundreds of erotic wall paintings, many of which were quickly put away. Museums called them indecent and locked them in restricted rooms. Scholars argued about whether Rome had been corrupt, but to the Romans themselves, this art was just part of the furniture. They did not use curtains to hide there. They used statues to honor them. Phalluses carved into road markers, into household shrines, even into the handles of oil lamps. One popular design showed Mercury, the god of trade, alongside a phallus, as if reminding merchants that success required more than gold. Another common figure was Priapus, a country god, always shown with an impossibly large erection, guarding gardens like a fertility scarecrow. The temples were no different. In places where people came to worship, images of intimacy were painted on the ceiling. Some shrines offered small figures or clay tablets showing lovers in detailed poses, asking the gods for passion, fertility, or control. Even in death, the images remained. Tombs carried writings with sexual jokes or references to past adventures. A man might be remembered not for kindness, but for stamina. This culture of visual sexuality was not without critics. Philosophers like Cicero and Seneca occasionally asked about the morality of public erotic art, but their voices were few. Most Romans, even those in high office, saw no conflict between power and pleasure. A general might kneel at a temple one day and host an erotic poetry reading the next. It was all part of a balanced life. The deeper message of these images was not about lust, it was about rank. The art reinforced who should be in charge, who should follow, who deserved pleasure, and who was meant to provide it. Even when the scene was playful or mythical, the roles were clear. Roman intimacy, even in paint, was a mirror of Roman society. What makes it unsettling is how normal it all was. No one flinched, no one whispered. They laughed, pointed, and sometimes added their own drawings beside the originals. The walls did not need ears. They had mouths, and they repeated the same message again and again. Dominance is beauty. Submission is forgettable. Next, we will go deeper into that message. Not through paint or stone, but through the tools Romans left behind. The walls could talk, the objects in their drawers could whisper something even stranger. From carved shapes to scented oils, from bronze mirrors to locked belts, the Roman appetite for control extended even to the instruments they used in bed. Let us open the drawer. The walls of Roman homes made their pleasures visible. But the drawers, the boxes, the private corners of those same homes told an even more personal story. While paintings showed what Romans believed about intimacy, the objects they used showed how they practiced it. Their appetite was not limited to partners. It extended to tools, devices shaped from wood, leather, and metal, some ordinary in form, others strange, all of them designed to excite, to dominate, or to amuse. These were not accidents of history. They were built with purpose, and in Rome that purpose was never questioned. Shaped objects, for example, have been uncovered in villas and bathhouses, stored carefully like any other household item. Some were carved from wood, others shaped in bronze. A few were covered in leather. Their size and shape varied, but the intention behind them was clear. They were not religious. They were not artistic. They were meant for use, and they were not hidden. Their presence did not cause a scandal. Instead, they reflected a world where physical curiosity had practical tools. It is one thing to imagine Roman excess, another to find the instruments still waiting where they were last left. These were not symbolic relics. They had wear marks. They had design details meant to make them more effective. Some even included rings for grip or attachments to be worn. Their existence suggests not just openness, but trying things out. Pleasure was not passive, it was shaped. Lubricants were common too. Romans had no shortage of ingredients. Olive oil was the most widely used, found in nearly every household and in nearly every kind of intimacy. But for more refined experiences, they turned to honey, animal fat, and scented creams. Recipes were passed down in plant manuals. Some included ingredients meant to excite, to numb, or to add scent. These were not secret recipes. They were shared like any beauty tip or health hint. These substances were not limited to bedroom use. In houses of pleasure, attendants applied oil before and after meetings, often warming it beforehand. The smell became part of the experience, sweet or musky, depending on the mix. In wealthier homes, servants kept small jars ready near beds or in washing areas. They were as essential as wine, as familiar as incense, and once again, their presence did not cause discomfort. They were as Roman as sandals. But the tools went beyond handheld objects. The Romans built furniture with intimacy in mind. Some chairs were designed to support unusual positions. Others had hand grips or adjustable angles. Beds in houses of pleasure were often set into stone with a mattress added on top. Some included shallow basins underneath for easy cleaning. Even household couches where guests might lie back during a feast could be given new purpose when the night turned physical. The lines between rest and indulgence blurred easily. Imagine a furniture store releasing a line called Domus Erotica and no one batting an eye. That was Rome. Furniture that served pleasure was not forbidden. It was practical. If a man could afford a better chariot or a better sword, why not a better bed for his tastes? The logic was steady. Comfort and conquest were always close. There is evidence of straps, too. Leather belts, bronze buckles, sometimes attached to walls or bedposts. Scholars debate their exact use. But the most likely explanation involves restraint, not as punishment, but as excitement. For Romans, control over the body was a mark of authority. Being able to bind another physically or socially was part of their identity. The same hands that signed orders might tie a knot just as carefully. Some temples even featured statues, holding or standing beside these kinds of objects. Priapus, the country fertility god, was often shown with exaggerated features, leaning against a post or balancing a scale. In some regions, small wooden shapes were offered as gifts to the gods, a prayer for fertility, pleasure, or the healing of physical troubles. Religion did not hide these things, it absorbed them. Even traveling Romans brought their tools. Portable kits found in army camps and merchant homes included small oils, tiny phallic charms, and sometimes collapsible accessories, just like grooming kits or coin pouches. These items reflected daily life. The line between usefulness and intimacy was thin. To us, they seemed like artifacts. To them, they were everyday items. The presence of these tools across all classes tells us that this was not only rich behavior. Market stalls sold cheaper versions. Some were made from clay or bone, common, easier to produce but less durable. There are wall writings referring to customers buying used items or craftsmen advertising their latest designs. Even the blacksmith could double as a maker of pleasure, shaping both blades and bedroom objects without changing the fire. What is notable is how little judgment appears in the old records. Satirists joked about size or performance, but rarely about the use of tools themselves. The criticism, when it came, was aimed at overuse or showing off. A man who depended too much on aids might be laughed at for softness, but the tools themselves were not questioned. Their existence was proof of Roman values, practical, direct, and willing to shape desire like any other part of life. What shocks modern viewers is not the tools themselves, but how ordinary they were in Roman hands. They were not locked away. They were laid out, cared for, replaced when worn. The culture did not treat physical desire as something dangerous to manage, but as something to be refined, like taste or conversation. Of course, the freedom to use these tools was not shared equally. As always, servants had no voice in how they were used. Women had less room to explore without consequences, and those at the bottom of society might use tools for others' pleasure, but never their own. Just because Rome built the devices did not mean it gave everyone the right to enjoy them. Still, these objects survived in museum drawers and dig sites. They sit quietly holding the fingerprints of a culture that took physical desire seriously, not in secret, not with shame, but with wood, oil, and iron. Next, we turn from tools to the ones who use them most visibly. Not in bedrooms or temples, but in open markets and alleys. Because in Rome, not all lovers were free, and the most visible figures of Roman intimacy were often the most vulnerable. The boys kept as favorites by powerful men. The tools of pleasure told one story. The people they used told another. In Rome, objects could be owned, but so could bodies. And in the highest circles of society, ownership was not only about work, it reached into intimacy. Roman elites did not only collect statues or chariots. Some of them collected boys, carefully chosen, closely watched, and completely controlled. These young companions served as living symbols of luxury and dominance. Their role was unspoken but understood. They were not adopted, they were not sons, they were for pleasure. Known as deliciae, meaning delights, these boys were often brought into wealthy homes as ornaments of excess. They came from conquered lands, servant markets, or poor Roman families who sold their children out of desperation. The wealthier the patron, the more beautiful the boy. He was trained not only in behavior, but in appearance. Hair curled, skin softened, body kept lean and young. In essence, he was turned into a decorative object that also happened to breathe. These boys were not hidden. They accompanied their patrons to dinners, rode with them in litters, and sometimes slept on cushions beside their feet during meetings. Their presence did not cause anger. It raised the status of the man who owned them. The ability to keep such a companion required wealth, quietness, and a name strong enough to push aside criticism. In public, the boys might pour wine or recite poems. In private, their duties were more personal. Agreement was never part of the arrangement. These boys had no voice in what they were expected to provide. Some were as young as 10, taken before they could understand their role. They were expected to please, to obey, and above all, to never challenge the man who owned them. If they showed unwillingness, they could be hit. If they aged out, they could be thrown away in every sense. They were possessions. Imagine living in a world where your body was polished like silver and shown off like furniture, and no one found that strange. That was the world of the deliciae. Their silence was not only expected, it was part of their appeal. To speak too much to show emotion was considered. The ideal boy was pretty, quiet, and bendable. And for Roman men, this kind of control was not wrong. It was admired. Some emperors made this practice shockingly public. Nero famously married a boy named Sporus, dressing him in women's clothes and calling him his wife. Later, he played the husband to another young man, swapping roles depending on the crowd. Elagabalus, another emperor, kept a whole household of young male lovers, rewarding them with titles and gifts. These actions raised eyebrows, but not because of the boys. The criticism came when the emperor appeared too emotionally attached or behaved too much like the following partner. The line was always about dominance. A man could surround himself with boys as long as he remained the master. Any sign that he was too soft, too gentle, or too invested made him open to mockery. Roman poets like Martial and Juvenal used this tension in their verses, mocking senators who cried over their favorites or spent more on perfume for a boy than on their household, but the ownership itself was never mocked. That part was normal. These relationships were often long, but rarely steady. A favorite might rise in influence, receiving better clothes, better food, and even property. But the position was uncertain. One mistake, one shift in mood, and the boy could be replaced. He might be sold, sent away, or even punished in public to show the master's detachment. There was no protection, no promise, only the appearance of closeness. The boys in turn learned to adjust. Some became skilled at using their beauty to gain favors, others pulled inward, surviving by obedience and quietness, and a few sadly ended their own lives before being thrown away. The system was not built to care for them, to show off the power of those who could afford them. Roman society rarely questioned the rightness of these arrangements. Philosophers argued about goodness, but few condemned the practice completely. It was simply one of many ways that wealth showed itself. A man might show off his garden, his library, his exotic birds, and his favorite boy in the same evening. Guests were expected to admire the choice, not challenge its morality. What makes it even darker is how ordinary it became. These boys appeared in love poems, plays, and gossip. Their names were known but not remembered. Their youth was praised, but their futures were ignored. When they disappeared, no one asked why. Someone younger always took their place. The physical objects from earlier, shaped tools, straps, and oils, were often used on these boys, not with them. The tools of Roman pleasure were rarely shared. They were applied to the bodies that could not say no, and that is what made it Roman, the lack of. Mutuality, the presence of control, the celebration of power without result. Some later Christian writers would condemn the practice. But by then it had already left its mark on the empire. The art, the poems, the laws, they all reflect a culture that measured men by how many things they could possess, including people. And in that list, the delicacies were just one more item, polished and placed like any other treasure. Next, we follow the logic of this control one step further. When the boundary of age disappeared, what else could? In the streets of Rome, children did not only see adult behavior. They were pulled into it, sold, traded, and used without shame. Because for Rome, power did not stop at the bedroom. It reached into the cradle. If Roman men could show off their boy companions in front of dinner guests without consequence, then it was no stretch for the empire to look past the boundaries of age entirely. The idea of a child being too young was not part of the Roman vocabulary. What mattered was whether they were useful, if they were quiet, obedient, and owned by someone else. Age became irrelevant. The younger the child, the less likely they were to resist. And in a world obsessed with dominance, that alone made them valuable. In Roman households, enslaved children were treated as tools, and the law did not require owners to think about their well-being. A child could be taken into the home to clean or serve, and just as easily expected to provide more personal services. There were no age limits. No oversight, no protections. If the child was a servant, they could not refuse. If they were free but poor, their safety depended entirely on the kindness of those around them. It was a structure built for silence. In Rome, childhood was not a protected stage of life. It was just another step on the ladder of control. A child could be bought, gifted, or inherited. And that exchange often included expectations that went far beyond work. Masters who favored young attendants were not shamed. They were admired for their taste. Their status made their choices untouchable, and the children themselves had no voice in the matter. Some of these children became known by name, usually in passing comments by poets or guests. A boy who poured wine with the right posture or who sang in a soft enough voice might be remembered briefly, but most faded into unknown. Their presence was expected, their obedience assumed, and their aging punished with dismissal. Many were replaced before they had even grown into their teens. Those who stayed longer often did so because they pleased their masters in ways that went beyond service. Girls were rarely treated any better. Young girls born into servitude could be placed in houses of pleasure before their bodies were fully formed. Customers paid more for those described as untouched, and Roman records reflect a dark interest in youth. Some girls were given basic training in manners to serve wealthier clients. Others were kept in rougher places where their first experiences were harsh and quick. The law did not step in. It simply taxed the establishment and kept a list of its earnings. In more wealthy homes, a girl might be kept as a companion from childhood. She would live under the same roof as the wife, but serve a different role. If she became pregnant, the child would belong to the master, and the girl would be praised for her fertility. If she resisted or aged, she would be sold or assigned elsewhere. No one asked how she felt. That question did not exist in the Roman structure. Usefulness was everything. Religious practices did not always. Fertility rites included young participants, especially girls chosen to stand for purity or rebirth. These children were often expected to take part in symbolic marriages or close rituals, watched by the community and approved by tradition. Whether those rituals were spiritual or physical, the child's. The rite was older than the law, and in the Roman world, tradition carried weight. Writers from the time did not hide these things. Some described the beauty of young limbs or the innocence of a trembling voice. Erotic poems made jokes about how young was too young. The teasing targeted the aging patron who could not resist a boy of 10, but never questioned the system that made such a thing possible. The joke was always about taste, never about right and wrong. What disturbs us now is not only what happened, but how it was ignored. There were no reformers, no whistleblowers, no structure for fairness. A child could be hurt, and no one would record it. The household would go on, the master's life would remain unchanged, and the child would be replaced as if they had never existed. Those children who survived learned quickly to adjust. They smiled when expected. They stayed close, but not too close. They understood silence as survival. Some gained small rewards like softer clothing or better food. Others were allowed to sleep inside, but even those comforts were not guaranteed. The power balance never changed. One wrong move, one sign of aging, and they were gone. A few philosophers hinted at unease. They wrote about moderation, about the importance of self-control. But even these voices were more concerned with how excess made a man look, not what it did to the person he used. There was no idea of emotional harm, no word for trauma. A child's pain did not carry forward. It stayed locked inside the walls where it began. Bathhouses were another space where children were exposed to risk. Young attendants scrubbed floors, carried towels, and sometimes received the wrong kind of attention. In the steam and laughter, age blurred. If a patron asked for more, the child could not refuse. The other patrons would look away. The owner would not step in. In public spaces, the same rules applied. Power decided what was allowed, not principle. Silence in the old records is not a sign that nothing happened. It is a sign that no one thought it mattered. These children were too small to write letters, too poor to pay for statues, and too replaceable to be mourned. Their suffering was not erased. It was never written in the first place. Rome prided itself on order, discipline, and structure. It built waterways, roads, and public squares that still stand. But under those stones were bodies that never had a say. Their names lost, their lives decided for them, their worth measured by how much they could endure without complaint. Next, we walk into the bathhouse itself, a place where the body was fully on display, where privacy vanished in the steam, and where dominance played out as casually as conversation. In that heat, every touch had meaning, and the walls watched everything. After passing through the heavy silence of childhood use, the Roman obsession with the body did not disappear. It simply stepped into the light. Busy bathhouses of Rome, undress was not hidden. It was expected. The bathhouse was the one place where class lines softened and fabrics fell away. Senators, merchants, servants, and visitors could all enter the same steam-filled space, undress without shame, and sink their bodies into water warmed by fires beneath the floor. In theory, these baths were places of cleaning. They had cold rooms, hot rooms, massage areas, and attendants offering oils and towels. But in practice, they became places of exposure. Not only physical exposure, but also social and intimate exposure. Once the tunic dropped, power dynamics changed. People watched one another. They noticed scars, build, and grooming. Nudity was not neutral. It carried messages, especially in a society that read everything as a sign of status or submission. It was like attending a work gathering where everyone was naked and pretending it was about health. Gossip moved through the steam faster than sound. Men compared themselves not only in wealth or muscle, but in size and boldness. Some used the space to show off their youth, others their confidence. A few used it to seek company. The line between social meeting and intimate opportunity blurred in the moisture on the walls. Women were not left out of this practice entirely. While some baths were single-gender by schedule, others allowed mixing, especially in country towns or during festivals. Roman writing and wall-scratching often suggest that mixed bathing was more common than elite writers like to admit. For many women, it was a chance to show confidence or playfulness. For others, it was a requirement of work, especially if they were masseuses, entertainers, or servants helping guests. To be a woman in a Roman bathhouse meant being watched. There was no such thing as privacy. Some women welcomed the gaze using jewelry or special oils to draw attention. Others simply endured it, understanding that refusing to bathe in public could raise questions. In Rome, too much modesty looked unnatural. A woman who hid her body was thought to be sick, ashamed, or rebellious, and rebellion was rarely forgiven. Not surprisingly, acts beyond bathing occurred. There are accounts and drawings of couples slipping away into corners, of playful games in the steam, of hands wandering beneath the water's surface. Some bathhouses became known for allowing these behaviors. Others pretended not to notice. A man might come for a soak and end up with more. A woman might go with a patron and be expected to agree. No one kept records. No one asked questions. Bathhouses were the Roman version of a nightclub, a spa, and a gossip column rolled into one. They were places where names could be made or ruined. A chance meeting with a senator could lead to a promotion. A casual comment could become tomorrow's rumor. Men discussed business while rubbing oil on one another's backs. Women watched from behind thin veils or towels, trying to keep dignity in a space that encouraged curiosity. There was even a ranking among bathhouse staff. The oil boys, the towel carriers, the musicians, the sellers who lingered at the entrances all played their roles. Some bathhouses had separate rooms for more private transactions. Others simply used the shadows between the columns. The boundaries were flexible. What mattered was who you were and how much you paid. That more than morality decided what was acceptable. Public paintings and statues inside these bathhouses reflected the same boldness. Erotic scenes painted above the pools, phallic symbols carved into benches, images of gods and mortals mixed in suggestive poses. It was not pornography as we know it. It was a cultural expression of control, fertility, and beauty. Children saw it. Elders laughed at it. Visitors from outside Rome sometimes reacted with discomfort. But Romans themselves seemed not to feel embarrassment. The empire's ability to normalize public undress was not without limits. Some careful voices tried to speak against it. A few senators warned that mixed bathing weakened Roman values. Certain emperors issued orders against women entering the baths at certain hours, but these rules were often ignored or quietly dropped. The desire for access and freedom within these spaces was too strong. The people had tasted a kind of openness and would not return to strict divisions. For all its openness, the bathhouse could still be dangerous, not only for the weak or the young, but for those whose names depended on quietness. A single accusation of improper behavior in the bath could grow into a full scandal. A servant might report a touch, a rival might spread a story, and in a city where whispers carried more weight than law, even a naked meeting in a steamy room could end a career. The bathhouse was the perfect picture of Roman life, everything exposed, nothing safe. You had to perform even in relaxation. How you walked across the wet tile, how you answered a joke, how long you stayed in the hot pool, it all meant something. People watched, they remembered, they told others. The bathhouse did not wash away wrongs, it showed them. To a modern eye, it seems strange that such a strict culture in law could be so free in public behavior, but Rome was full of contradictions. They punished unfaithfulness, yet allowed houses of pleasure. They praised goodness, but painted erotic art. They feared moral decline, yet gathered at festivals that celebrated excess. The bathhouse stood at the center of this confusion, a temple to the body and a stage for the ego. Looking back, it is easy to imagine these rooms as exotic or free. But for many, especially those without status, they were places of pressure and performance. To be seen was to be judged. To relax was to risk exposure. And behind every smile in the steam, there was calculation. Now we go even deeper into Rome's rituals of exposure, not only with bodies, but with belief, where intimacy met religion, and where gods watched what mortals did with trembling approval. After the steamy haze of the Roman bathhouses, where bodies moved freely and rules seemed to blur, the city's obsession with intimacy did not pause behind closed doors. It found its way into scrolls, songs, and verses. In ancient Rome, eroticism did not only belong to the bed or the bath. It lived in ink. Roman poets, playwrights, and musicians made no effort to hide their intentions. Intimacy was not only acted out, it was written, sung, and performed. This culture of written openness served both to entertain and to teach, blurring the line between art and instruction. Public readings of erotic poetry were common, often taking place in villas, gardens, or taverns. Young men would gather to hear verses laced with suggestion, laughter rising with each clever joke or vivid image. These were not shy declarations of romantic love. They were bold, unapologetic celebrations of the body. Some poems describe physical acts in such detail that even modern readers might wince. Yet in Rome, such boldness was considered wit, not rudeness. To speak freely about intimacy was a mark of sophistication, not shame. One of the most influential voices of this world was Publius Ovidius Naso, better known as Ovid. His works, especially Ars Amatoria and Amores, were widely read by both the wealthy and those who wished to rise. These texts were not hidden in private libraries. They were shared, quoted, and even given as gifts to lovers. In Ars Amatoria, Ovid instructs young men on how to attract women, how to behave in the arena, where to sit in the theatre to improve their chances, and what compliments might win a heart or a knight. It was less a love guide and more a social strategy book for bedroom success. He did not stop with advice for men. Later books in the series offered guidance for women as well, suggesting how to keep their appeal, how to manage lovers, and how to handle jealousy. Ovid's tone was playful, even teasing, but his message was serious in its reach. For many young Romans, his books were their first formal lessons in attraction, desire, and sexual politics. The state disapproved, but the public enjoyed his work eagerly. These writings also slipped into education. Boys learning to read Latin would sometimes study sentences taken from love poetry. Teachers might skip over the more colorful parts, but the students certainly remembered them. Even within philosophy schools, discussions of love and desire were not uncommon. Stoics and Epicureans argued about the good and bad sides of passion, sometimes quoting poets whose words sat on the line between beauty and rudeness. Beyond poetry, music carried the same themes. Songs about lovers, betrayal, and forbidden touch filled the air at Roman dinners. Some tunes were simple, others haunting. Musicians played in wealthy dining rooms, sometimes accompanying dances that moved into the erotic. The performers were often enslaved or hired specifically for their sensual appeal. Their movements, lyrics, and gestures reinforced Rome's view that desire was not to be hidden but arranged. In a way, these performances were Rome's ancient version of adult entertainment, just with more liars. No one found it strange to blend eating with flirting, music with moaning. To throw a party without some kind of sensual fun was considered poor taste. Guests expected laughter, rhythm, and suggestion. Anything less felt stiff. The theatre was yet another stage for these impulses. Roman comedies, especially those based on Greek originals, often featured double meanings, physical humor, and situations built around lust and trickery. Audiences loved watching characters stumble through romantic troubles, often driven by their own appetites. Some plays included scenes so clear that actors would mimic intimate acts for shock and laughter. Far from offending, these moments drew applause. Not all Romans were amused. Conservative voices criticized the moral slide, warning that too much exposure to erotic content weakened discipline and pulled attention from duty. Some senators and thinkers called for censorship. On occasion, certain works were banned or burned, but the hunger for such material remained strong. The more they were condemned, the more they spread. Erotic wall writing covered the walls of cities like Pompeii. Crude jokes, proud confessions, and poetic one-liners were scratched into stone beside doorways near fountains, even in public toilets. These messages were not only private outbursts. They reflected a culture where talk about intimacy was as common as gossip. Reading Roman walls today is like scrolling through the ancient version of social media, filled with flirtation, bragging, and dirty jokes. Some writings were soft, others were rough, a few were surprisingly poetic, but all of them showed how deeply physical language was woven into daily life. It was not considered taboo to speak of a lover's body or a night's pleasure. Was almost expected. Silence was the greater fault. If you had an experience, you shared it. If you wanted something, you sang about it. Of course, this openness did not mean freedom for all. While men could joke and boast, women were more carefully watched, or not virtuous. I'd be called bold or not virtuous. Performers of both sexes were often used, expected to smile and attract without any real power. And while some poets like Ovid earned praise, others were punished for stepping beyond what the state accepted. Still, the sheer amount of surviving erotic writing and wall scratches tells a clear story. Rome viewed intimacy as a part of life to be discussed, celebrated, and performed. Its culture accepted contradiction. It punished unfaithfulness while encouraging flirtation. It preached modesty while hosting wild feasts, and through it all, the written word remained one of its most lasting tools for excitement and amusement. I find it strangely honest that the Romans did not pretend to be pure. They made no effort to hide their fascinations behind fancy words. Their poems were bold, their songs playful, and their theatres rowdy. It may be jarring to modern readers, but it was utterly Roman in its logic. It is a bit like giving teenagers today a love guide written by a stand-up comedian. You know, it is trouble, but they will read every word. That was the effect Ovid had. He knew exactly how to turn desire into performance, and performance into influence. Sometimes I think their openness says more about our own discomfort than their badness. They accepted what we still debate. As we leave behind the verses and songs, the next step leads us deeper into physical reality. Because what the Romans wrote about, they often built in stone. From houses of pleasure to bedrooms, their buildings mirrored their passions with rooms designed not only for privacy, but for show. As we step into the private chambers and back alleys of ancient Rome, one truth becomes harder to ignore. The Romans were far less limited by modern ideas of sexual identity. Same-sex relations, particularly between men, were not only allowed in many circles. They were expected, even celebrated as long as certain social rules were followed. It was not about who you wanted, but how you showed it. That difference made all the difference between admiration and shame. In Roman society, the idea of manhood did not forbid male-male relations. What mattered was who held the leading role. The man who entered kept his honor. The one who received, especially if he was a freeborn Roman male, risked mockery or worse. This pattern was less about affection and more about power. The ladder of Roman culture reached into every bedroom. As long as the man kept his status as the one who entered, his name remained clean. This is why relations between older Roman men and their younger male companions, often servants or freed men, were common. These relationships were not hidden in shame. In some cases, they were openly known and even shown off. Emperors like Hadrian, who loved the youth Antinous, left behind monuments and coins in his honor. Their story was both political and deeply personal. Antinous' death hurt Hadrian so deeply that he ordered the young man made into a god. Statues of Antinous still stand today, carved in marble with the same respect given to gods. It is oddly modern to see how public affection between two men did not necessarily spark anger as long as the roles stayed within Roman norms. The contradiction lies in their logic. Dominance equaled goodness, and submission equaled weakness. The mechanics of intimacy were less important than their social meaning. There are records of symbolic marriages between men, especially in the later empire. Some of these were private, others were watched by guests at happy ceremonies. These unions held no legal standing, but they showed how the desire for connection, recognition, and ritual existed even outside the law. Roman satirists often made fun of such pairings, but their existence shows how lasting and visible they were. In cities like Pompeii, walls and wall paintings revealed far more than one might expect. Paintings of male-male intimacy were found not only in houses of pleasure, but in private homes. The variety of scenes ranged from funny to soft, erotic to religious. These images were not hidden. They were part of daily life, seen as natural expressions of human behavior. Some even suggest these pictures had protective or celebratory meanings, keeping away bad luck or honoring fertility gods. If Roman sexuality had a saying, it might have been "everything is allowed, but only if the right person does it." That saying captures the twisted fairness of the Roman system. A freeborn man could share a bed with male or female partners of lower status without result. But to be seen in a following role was seen as a moral failure. This logic even reached into army life. Roman soldiers were forbidden from taking passive roles in intimacy, not for moral reasons, but because it was seen as unfitting with discipline and strength. This strict view created space for hypocrisy. Men who publicly condemned same-sex behavior might privately enjoy it. Poets like Martial and Juvenal wrote verses teasing senators and philosophers for their hidden lovers. These jabs were not only playful, they were political weapons made to unseat rivals or stir public talk. A line of poetry could end a career if it made the wrong accusation. Women, on the other hand, were barely part of this conversation. Female-female intimacy was often ignored or dismissed as harmless. Roman writers rarely described women loving women in detail. When they did, it was usually as a curiosity or insult. The lack of rules or discussion does not mean it did not exist. It simply means it was not seen as threatening. Roman men in their confidence assumed that without a man, intimacy was incomplete. That said, there were women who broke those expectations. Old texts mention women who dressed as men, took male lovers, or followed women with boldness. Some were made fun of, others feared. But most of their stories are lost to time, filtered through the pens of men who could not quite understand or accept their choices. Still, their presence hints at a deeper world of sexual identity that was never fully written down. I find it telling that Roman society allowed more freedom in acts than in roles. They were not afraid of same-sex love. They were afraid of being seen as weak. That fear shaped laws, customs, and even art. The images of lovers on Pompeii's walls were not warnings. They were reflections showing how desire flowed freely, but always downstream of power. It reminds me of how some modern societies still care less about who you love and more about whether you act right according to your gender. The same scripts keep playing, just with new costumes. Rome had no suits and internet filters, but the worry is the same. Sometimes I wonder how many lives were twisted because a man had to pretend strength meant denying affection. That lie lasted centuries. It still echoes today in rules, in insults, in silences. The Romans did not invent sexual roles, but they made them into an art. In the end, same-sex love in Rome was never really about love at all. It was about status. It was about power. It was about making sure everyone stayed in their place, even in bed. That does not erase the moments of tenderness or connection that surely existed, but it frames them within a world where even intimacy had a ladder. As we move forward, the Roman obsession with rank and dominance shows its shadow side. Because the same system that allowed sexual freedom for some allowed the most terrible uses of others, especially those too young to resist. That is the darker turn we must take next. Despite the open expression of physical freedom among powerful Roman men, marriage remained one of the most stiff and controlled parts of society. For many Roman families, especially among the upper classes, marriage had little to do with love or friendship. It was a tool for continuing bloodlines, gathering wealth, and keeping social standing. A husband and wife could live in the same home for decades and yet remain emotionally distant, bound only by duty and family line. Weddings were often arranged before the bride had even reached adulthood. The purpose was not emotional happiness, but biological production. A wife was expected to have children as soon as possible, preferably sons, and remain loyal to her husband, even if he did not return that loyalty. Her body was not her own, but the property of two families and finally the Roman state. She was a container for heritage, nothing more. Roman law placed the weight of family honor on the woman's shoulders. A wife who was suspected of unfaithfulness could be divorced, publicly shamed, or worse. Her actions, real or imagined, reflected not only on her but on the men around her, her father, her husband. Even her adult sons could suffer reputation damage if she failed to live up to her expected role. That role was simple: remain quiet, obedient, and fertile. The same pressure was not placed on men. A Roman husband was free to seek pleasure wherever he chose as long as it was done quietly or with partners seen as socially acceptable. Sellers, male or female servants, and even companions were seen as acceptable outlets for male desire. This double standard was not hidden. It was openly known, even joked about in writing and gossip. It is hard not to roll your eyes when you realize that Rome had rules for everything except male restraint. The expectations placed on women were suffocating, while men were given the freedom to behave however they pleased so long as they kept appearances intact. In many homes, especially in the wealthier parts of Rome, the emotional lives of husbands and wives existed in separate. A man might spend his nights drinking and socializing with companions while his wife stayed apart in the inner rooms, managing the household and raising the children. Contact between the two could be very little even after years of marriage. Letters from the period show more concern for property and politics than for affection or care. Some women, especially those born into more open households, found ways to make space for themselves. They read, wrote poetry, studied philosophy, or hosted gatherings. But for many others, especially those of the middle class, life was limited to silence and service. They were taught to avoid eye contact, speak softly, and never question their husband's choices. The idea of a romantic partnership between equals was not only rare, it was almost non-existent. Modern couples complain about growing apart over time, but Roman couples often started out distant and just stayed that way. Marriage was not meant to fulfill you emotionally. It was meant to steady the empire. In public life, a married woman might appear at her husband's side during ceremonies, but she rarely had a voice in decisions. Behind closed doors, she might have influence, especially over her sons. But this power was informal and fragile. A single misstep could erase years of careful behavior. A rumor, a servant's story, or a neighbor's observation could turn a respected wife into a disgrace overnight. Despite all this, the Roman state depended on these marriages. Without them, there would be no heirs, no alliances, and no continuity. The family was the smallest part of the empire, and marriage was its foundation. That is why so much attention was placed on keeping its image, even when its reality was empty. There are preserved legal papers detailing dowries, divorce settlements, and care of children. These were not only dry records. They were proof of how businesslike Roman marriage could be. A woman could be sent back to her father's house like returned goods. The only thing expected of her was that she leave behind legitimate children. You can sense the emotional hunger that must have lingered beneath the surface for many women. Locked in roles they did not choose, surrounded by expectations they could not challenge. Many of them found small ways to resist. Some became supporters of the arts. Others used religion as a form of personal expression. A few, rare and brave, followed relationships on their own terms, but at great risk. Among the wealthy there were women like Julia, the daughter of Emperor Augustus, who became known for her affairs. But her fate was a warning, not an inspiration. Despite her status, she was eventually sent away, her lovers punished, and her name stained. Rome allowed women to be clever, but not bold. Once they crossed the invisible line, the punishment was quick and harsh. I have always found it striking how Rome built an empire on control but allowed its own homes to be so emotionally empty. The contradiction is hard to miss. They conquered the world but failed to grow closeness at home. In writing, some Roman poets tried to write about love, but even those verses were touched with power dynamics and possessiveness. Love, if it appeared at all, was rarely mutual. It was about victory, devotion, or obsession. Few lines show tenderness, and even fewer show the wife as a partner rather than a duty. And so Roman marriages continued generation after generation, built not on affection but on need. They were alliances, contracts, performances. Behind closed doors, some couples may have found friendship, but for most the marriage bed was colder than marble and just as unforgiving. Up next, we will step away from the cold halls of marriage and into the hot, crowded streets of Roman festivals. Because when duty ended, indulgence began. And that is where the next shock waits. In a society where Roman women were mostly limited to their homes, expected to be silent, modest, and loyal, a strange contradiction began to appear. The very role seen as most shameful, that of a seller of intimacy, offered certain freedoms that respectable women could only dream of. While wives were watched, judged, and bound by expectations of goodness, registered sellers could move about more freely, dress how they pleased, and even speak boldly in public. And so some Roman women found an unexpected opening. They pretended to be sellers. This was not a choice made lightly. For a woman of status, even pretending to belong to a lower class could damage her name forever. But for some, the risk was worth the reward. To register as a meretrix or seller meant stepping outside the suffocating rules of proper womanhood. You were no longer bound by the same codes of behavior. You could own your body, your time, and your choices. That kind of freedom was exciting. Women who wore this disguise could leave their homes without a male escort. They could wear brightly colored dresses, show more skin, and reject the heavy coverings that noble women were expected to wear. In a society obsessed with modesty, at least when it came to women, this visual freedom alone must have felt like a rebellion. But even more powerful was the social space it opened. As a supposed seller, a woman could speak more openly, flirt with men, and even refuse advances without being accused of disrespect. It says a lot about Roman society that pretending to be a sex worker gave women more freedom than being a wife. That turning of values tells us where real control lived, not in law, but in appearances. There are scattered records and rumors of wealthy women slipping into the cellar districts, not for work, but for privacy. In those places, no one expected them to behave like daughters or wives. There was laughter, conversation, and sometimes even thoughtful exchange. In fact, some women used this disguise to meet with lovers or political allies away from their household's watchful eyes. And as long as no one recognized them, they could live briefly in a world without judgment. Some went even further. They played the role not only for a night, but as a part-time identity. They kept their homes and servants, but after dark took on new names and personalities. Roman satire and gossip columns often hinted at these double lives. One poet made fun of a woman who wore the robe of a wife by day and the thin dress of a seller by night. But the teasing tone could not hide the fascination. These women were seen as daring, even dangerous, because they refused to be boxed in. Compared to today's secret dating apps and hidden accounts, Rome's version of double life required real courage. There were no second chances if you were caught. A single slip, a familiar face, or a spiteful rival could reveal the trick and destroy your standing forever. And yet, some women not only got away with it, they did well. There were cases where a woman's name as a courtesan became more influential than her family's name. Some of the most famous women in Roman society were former or active sellers. They attended dinners, wrote poetry, and even owned property. Their fame sometimes outshone that of noble women whose voices were rarely heard outside their own walls. For young girls growing up in such a world, the message was both confusing and clear. On one hand, they were told to value purity and silence. On the other hand, they saw powerful women gain attention, lovers, and influence by stepping outside those rules. The contradiction created tension in the culture. Fathers and husbands tried harder to lock things down. More rules were added, more watching followed. But desire is hard to control, and so is the hunger for freedom. Some Roman writers were shocked by this trend. They wrote bitterly about wives behaving like harlots, as if the line between the two had dissolved. But their anger covered worry. When women discovered even a small piece of freedom, it threatened the whole structure. If wives could become courtesans and return home untouched, what did that mean for the system of marriage, dowry, and control? The state did not have a clear answer. Laws around selling intimacy were uneven and often not enforced. There were taxes to be paid and certain districts to stay within. But beyond that, much was left to social pressure. That made the line between respectable and shameful dangerously thin. A woman might be called a whore for wearing the wrong color or speaking too loudly. In such an environment, taking back the label on her terms became an act of defiance. It is striking how much power some women found in the very space meant to humiliate them. By stepping into roles society tried to shame, they turned the script, even if only briefly. It was not about embracing vice. It was about escaping the narrow hallway of goodness. Of course, this kind of double life was not possible for everyone. Most women did not have the luxury of risk. For them, stepping outside their roles could mean ruin or violence. But those who dared, who wore the mask and slipped into the night, left behind a crack in the wall, a whisper that things did not have to be this way forever. We can still see echoes of them in Roman writing. Wall scratches and satire, the bold woman, the unruly wife, the disguised matron. They were made fun of, yes, but they were remembered. In a world that tried to forget women outside of motherhood, that is no small victory. Next, we will step into another contradiction. The Roman obsession with public nudity and bathhouses, where shame met showing off, and where control gave way to excess. Things are about to get steamier in more ways than one. Under Roman law and social custom, a woman's body was never really her own. It belonged to her father until she married, and then to her husband. Her value rested in her purity, her silence, and her loyalty. Not only emotionally, but physically. When a woman broke those expectations, or was even thought to have done so, the results were quick and often harsh. Unlike their male counterparts, Roman women were not allowed the comfort of a secret mistake. The state and the household both expected a level of moral perfection that no man was required to match. An upper-class Roman man could have mistresses, male lovers, or casual meetings with servants and face no legal result. But if a woman dared to have intimacy outside of marriage, the penalties could change her life. Unfaithfulness was not only a betrayal of a husband, it was framed as a threat to the wholeness of the family, the bloodline, and by extension, the state. To be unfaithful was to bring doubt into inheritance, legitimacy, and public name. And for that, Roman women paid a high price. The punishments for a woman caught in unfaithfulness varied depending on her status and her husband's mood. At best, she might be publicly divorced and disgraced. At worst, she could be stripped of her dowry, sent away, or physically marked. One known. Punishment was the cutting of the nose, a visible and permanent mark that made her unmarriageable and socially ruined. Some men went further, especially in private, giving their own forms of justice with beatings or starvation. Roman law did not always step in, it often stepped aside. It is ironic how the system punished women more for being harmed than men for harming. If a woman was attacked and failed to prove it with witnesses, an almost impossible task, she could still be punished for dishonor. The burden of proof sat on her shoulders, not the attackers. That meant many women stayed quiet, knowing that speaking out could destroy what was left of their lives. In some cases, the attacker might even be forgiven if he claimed the woman led him on, or if she was seen as too tempting in behavior or dress. Compared to today's conversations about blaming the victim, Rome turned it into official policy. There was no difference between agreement and force in many cases, especially when the victim was a woman of lower status or a servant. Even worse, these expectations were not only enforced by law or men. Other women, especially older wives, sometimes became the enforcers of moral discipline. They gossiped, judged, and moved away from any woman thought to have misstepped. Respectable women were not only expected to behave well, they were expected to watch each other. It was a form of social self-policing that made sure the ladder stayed in place even when the state was not watching. Meanwhile, men acted without result. A husband could visit a house of pleasure, sleep with his servants, or even attract his friends' wives, and society would look the other way. The double standard was not only cultural, it was built into Roman law itself. The Lex Julia de Adulteriis Coascendis, passed under Augustus, made unfaithfulness a public crime, but only really enforced it when a woman was involved. Husbands were even encouraged to bring their unfaithful wives to court to avoid being seen as weak or cheated. But if the husband wandered, there was no corresponding shame or trial. This created a world where women had to move through every interaction with care. A smile could be misunderstood. A rumor could start in a bathhouse and travel faster than a horse. To remain respectable, a woman had to perform goodness constantly in how she dressed, walked, spoke, and even looked at others. And it was not only young women who suffered under this gaze. Widows, older wives, and even childless women were all subject to the same pressures. Some tried to avoid these rules quietly. They wrote poetry under male false names, held private gatherings, or formed close friendships in secret. But they always risked exposure. One scandal could ruin not only a woman, but her whole household. Her father could lose public office. Her children could be disinherited. The cost of being seen as sexually independent was never limited to the individual. It is hard not to feel that Roman society was designed to break women before they ever made a mistake. The idea of female honor was so fragile that it could shatter under a glance or a rumor. And once broken, there was no healing. Even emperors, when trying to enforce morality, showed how empty the ideals were. Augustus famously sent away his daughter Julia for unfaithfulness, banishing her to a far island with no male visitors allowed. Her crime was loving too freely. But her father's many affairs were never questioned. His role as emperor allowed him to define morality while ignoring it himself. Over time, these legal and cultural limits narrowed women's lives more and more. Their physical bodies became the ground of political control. Whether through forced marriage, legal penalties, or social rejection, Rome made it clear: a woman's sexuality was not her own. It was a mirror for her family's pride, her husband's control, and her state's power. The tragedy is not only that women were punished, it is that they were taught to see punishment as natural, to suffer in silence, to accept blame, to take in shame. These were lessons taught from girlhood. They were not only taught obedience, they were taught to believe it was honorable. And yet, history remembers them. The quiet ones, the defiant ones, the broken ones. Even in records written mostly by men, their stories leak through. There are glimpses of resistance, sadness, and endurance. Rome may have tried to erase them, but in doing so, it showed just how powerful they were. Next, we enter the world of wealthy Roman parties, where women found surprising leverage, sometimes by becoming what society feared most. If punishment for women was harsh and unending, the freedom given to powerful men seemed without limit. Beyond the carefully written laws and household expectations, there were halls of Roman life where even the most twisted behaviors found shelter. Once a man had enough wealth, status, or connections, almost nothing was off the table. Depravity did not disqualify you from power. Sometimes it helped you hold on to it. The deeper you look into the private lives of the Roman wealthy, the more you see a pattern that was not only about excess, but about how power bent every boundary of decency. Accounts from Roman historians and satirists often described acts that today would be unthinkable. These were not the stories of criminals hiding in alleys. They were centered around palaces, villas, and rich dinners. Some emperors like Caligula and Nero became known not only for their political chaos, but for their personal pleasures. Caligula was accused of forcing noble women to perform publicly in sex shows, treating the imperial palace as a stage for perversion. Nero allegedly enjoyed theatrical displays of violence, dressed as an animal where humans were tied down and treated as prey. Whether every detail of these stories was true or stretched, they paint a disturbing picture of what society allowed when a man stood at the top. When you read these records, you get the sense that shame did not exist in the imperial court, only show. These acts were not hidden in shadows, but often presented with ceremony. Everything could be excused as performance, ritual, or even divine copying. It was said that if something pleased the gods or entertained the guests, it needed no further excuse. That is the problem with power left unchecked. It does not need to explain itself. In some parts of Roman society, religion and intimacy were woven together in uncomfortable ways. Certain groups, especially fringe or imported ones, had rituals involving intimacy or symbolic fertility acts. While not mainstream, these practices were allowed or even respected in certain circles. The line between religious devotion and personal pleasure became hard to trace. Statues of gods with exaggerated sexual features stood openly in temples. Charms shaped like male parts were worn for protection. Wall paintings showing group intimacy or control were placed in public bathhouses or private bedrooms. The unusual was not seen as shocking. It was normalized. The more disturbing stories involved the role of animals in Roman sexual fun. While records are limited, some ancient writers did describe performances that included animal elements. These were not only wild rumors passed by enemies, but claims written into biographies of emperors by Roman historians themselves. Nero, for instance, was said to have arranged shows where men or women were tied to stakes and attacked by people dressed as animals, or in some readings, actual animals. These events were described as part of the games or private parties. Even if only some of these accounts were true, the fact that they were believed tells us a lot about what people thought their rulers were capable of. Imagine a modern leader being remembered not for their policies, but for tying people up and copying wild animals for excitement. That is the scale of difference we are dealing with here, in ancient Rome. Cruelty did not stop someone from being admired. It sometimes became part of their legend. Writers who told of these emperors did not always condemn them. Some just described their acts with a strange tone of distance, as if nothing could surprise them anymore. The reality was that nothing would be done to stop these practices if the man in question had enough status. Laws are applied differently depending on your place on the ladder. A common man caught doing any act seen as indecent could be beaten, shamed, or worse.
A senator or emperor, on the other hand, might call the same act a performance or a ritual. The system did not only accept inequality, it depended on it. There were also private rooms within wealthy homes that were set aside specifically for unusual tastes. Digs in cities like Pompeii have revealed wall paintings and objects that suggest the existence of special spaces for intimate trying out. Some of them decorated with scenes of binding, control, or exaggerated human-animal mixes. These were not hidden in shame. They were proudly shown. Guests would walk into these spaces and be expected to laugh, admire, or join in. What strikes me the most is not that individuals went to extremes, but that the system allowed and even celebrated it. You could abuse, lower, and humiliate others in the name of fun, as long as you were rich enough. There was no moral line, just a social rank. And for those at the top, even the darkest wishes could be presented as culture. Philosophers occasionally tried to push back. Seneca, a Stoic thinker close to Nero, wrote about balance and control. But even he struggled to match his ideals with the reality of court life. His warnings were often lost in the applause of the crowd. Roman society did not want to hear about self-restraint. It wanted bread, wine, and scandal, and those who gave it most richly won favor, not blame. That kind of culture did not only affect the wealthy, it trickled down. When the most visible people in a society act without limits, everyone else slowly changes. What was once seen as shocking becomes amusing. What was once forbidden becomes tradition, and that is the scariest part. The empire that built roads and waterways also built a culture where screams could be part of the evening show, where shame was seen as weakness, where cruelty was dressed as celebration. There is no denying that Rome left behind remarkable gifts, but it also left scars hidden in the writings and objects that remain. They speak of a world where desire and control were the same, where no act was too far if it came with applause, and where a man could stand naked beside a chained victim and still be called divine. Next, we will look not at the palace, but at the stage. Roman theatre was not only drama and poetry, it was also a space where intimacy, satire, and shame played out for all to see. And what happened on that stage tells us even more about what society expected you to laugh at or want. If a Roman servant was considered property, a eunuch was something even more specific, not only owned, but reshaped. Castration in ancient Rome was not always for punishment or medical need. Sometimes it was simply about control, about turning a person into something else, someone easier to use. Boys were chosen, often from conquered peoples, to be made into eunuchs, and then trained for service. Once their bodies were changed, they were placed into roles no free man would accept. They were guards in women's rooms, bath attendants for noble ladies, singers in the homes of the wealthy, or even intimate servants to powerful men and women who preferred pleasure without worry. The process itself was violent. It usually happened young, before puberty, with simple tools and little care. The removal of the testicles, or sometimes more, left lasting damage. These boys grew into men with high voices, soft features, and no real freedom. They were kept close by the rich, not for respect, but for use. It is hard to imagine a society where your value increases after they destroy part of your body. The Roman wealthy saw this not as cruelty but as improvement. A changed servant was a safer servant. The most common place for a eunuch was in the service of noble women. Roman men were deeply worried about controlling female sexuality. A eunuch, seen as neither fully man nor fully woman, became the perfect middle ground. He could help dress the women, attend them in the bath, deliver their letters, and even serve as a friend. All of this without posing a threat to their name. It was not unusual for high-ranking women to grow attached to their eunuchs, trusting them more than their own husbands. But no matter how close the relationship, these men were always reminded of their place. Their change followed them into every room. Beyond home service, some eunuchs were used for fun. Their voices, kept high by early castration, remained unusually high. This made them prize singers for wealthy Romans who loved music at private dinners. Others, however, were chosen for more obvious roles. In households known for excess, eunuchs were expected to entertain in more personal ways. Their lack of manhood made them ideal for clients who wanted to enjoy same-sex acts while avoiding the shame of being seen with a real man. In a world obsessed with status, even sexual, preference had to be negotiated through rank. There are records suggesting that some emperors kept personal eunuchs, not only for service but for intimacy. These boys and men had no legal standing and no ability to refuse. They were treated more like objects than people, expected to be available at all times. In some cases, they were even dressed in fancy costumes to heighten their appeal. Their identity was erased. They were not men, not servants, not citizens. They were functioning. It feels disturbing that the same society that built waterways and wrote laws also saw value in creating eunuchs for pleasure. The mental split is staggering. Rome was a civilization obsessed with structure, but it structured its cruelty with just as much care. Eunuchs were given rooms, clothing, and tasks. Everything about them was managed except their freedom. They were not allowed to have families, property, or even their own choices about food and clothing. In modern times, we think of workplace use as a serious issue: long hours, no pay, unsafe environments. But in Rome, some people were stripped of their very biology to meet workplace expectations. Imagine applying for a job today and being told the first requirement is to lose part of your body. That was the reality for these men. There was no interview, no agreement, only pain and then service. What makes this darker is that many of these eunuchs were not forgotten. They appear in poetry, in satire, even in love letters. Roman writers made jokes about their high voices, their thin bodies, and their supposed emotional weakness. Even in death, they were made fun of. Their graves rarely carried their real names, just labels, titles. And behind every label was a lifetime of service that no one cared to remember. Some households had many eunuchs, each with a special role. One might prepare the mistress for sleep, another manage her jewelry, and another entertain guests with song. All of them worked in silence. They could not object, and any sign of upset might be seen as weakness or lack of thanks. Their pain was supposed to be invisible. That is how the wealthy excused it. They believed that once the body was changed, so was the soul. The man they once were had vanished. What remained was a function, not a person. Even the law treated them differently. If a eunuch was harmed, there were no standard protections. If he was killed, it was treated more like the breaking of furniture than the killing of a human being. That tells you everything about how Rome viewed them, not only disposable, but below notice. Their castration removed their voice both literally and politically. There is something terrifying about how ordinary this all seemed to them. Castration was not hidden. It was not considered shocking. It was just one more way to shape society to the desires of the powerful. For those born into the wrong family or captured during the wrong war, there was no escaping that fate. And for those who lived through it, there was no way to get back their life. They were changed not only for use, but for the pleasure of others. In the grand villas of Rome, the laughter at parties often covered someone's permanent loss. While guests drank wine and listened to music, a eunuch stood nearby, smiling when asked, bowing when required, and never forgetting what had been taken from him. He could not run, he could not scream, he could only serve. And yet, even within such cruelty, Rome still managed to see itself as civilized. It wrote laws, it carved gods, it mapped the stars. But beneath it all, behind closed doors, it cut boys so the rich could feel more comfortable. That contradiction was not hidden, it was designed. Next, we look into how Roman society blurred the line between punishment and perversion when pain became theater and intimacy was used as show. If reshaping the human body was one way the Romans chased control, then managing desire through potions was another. In the search for affection, power, or simply lust, Romans turned to mixtures that promised to excite, to bind, or to inflame. These were not the secret tricks of witches hidden in the forest. These were household practices, market exchanges, and whispered recipes passed from one rich gathering to another. Aphrodisiacs and love spells were a regular part of Roman life, woven into the way people thought about attraction and power. Common ingredients were nothing short of strange by modern standards. Dried goat testicles were ground into powder and stirred into wine. Bat blood, believed to hold the spirit of darkness and mystery, was used in love potions meant to make a partner more obedient. Herbs like Satyrion and Rocket were soaked in oil or left in wine, producing a drink that was both sharp and bitter. Sellers in the markets of Rome carried small bottles of these mixtures wrapped in leather or stored in carved bone containers. They were sold quietly but not illegally. There were even professionals, known as philtropoioi, who made custom aphrodisiacs on request. Wealthy clients might approach them in secret, describing the person they desired and the nature of the problem. Was it a spouse losing interest? A lover wandering? A man ignoring a mistress? The philtropoios would then mix roots, minerals, and animal products into a liquid that promised results. In a world without dating apps, nothing says romance like powdered goat testicles in your wine glass. These remedies were not always subtle. Some had strong smells or tasted bad, but users believed in them, especially if the desired partner started acting more affectionate. Whether the effects were real or imagined hardly mattered. The belief itself carried weight. A confident person, sure their potion had worked, would act differently. That change alone often shifted relationships. Women, in particular, made use of love potions. Unlike men who could assert their will more directly, women often worked through hidden influence.
Wife, fearing her husband's wandering eye, might slip a potion into his evening wine. A courtesan hoping to secure a wealthy patron might feed him enchanted honey cakes. These acts were not seen as foolish or shameful. They were practical. Love was hard to secure in a society where marriage was often arranged and passion was not guaranteed. Some of the most curious practices came from magical rituals mixed with aphrodisiacs. A woman might collect her lover's sweat-stained clothing, burn part of it, and mix the ashes with wine. Another might scratch the name of her beloved into a piece of lead and bury it under his doorstep. These rites were often paired with eating stimulating herbs. Desire in this context was not left to chance. It was built one strange step at a time. Compared to modern marketing for scented candles and body sprays, the Romans really went all in. They did not only hope to be noticed, they wanted to change fate. Some texts even mention using menstrual blood as an ingredient in binding spells hidden in food or drink. It was believed to tie the receiver emotionally and physically to the giver. Today, that would result in a criminal charge and probably a lot of therapy. Many potions were designed not only to excite, but to bind. They were made to create obsession, not only lust. The Romans believed that a person under the influence of a strong love spell could become loyal, even submissive. The balance of power in a relationship could be shifted entirely through these mixtures. Some women used them to keep control in situations where they otherwise had little say. It makes sense. In a society so obsessed with control that even love had to be won chemically, there was no room for surprise. Everything, including affection, had to be managed. This also created a whole hidden culture of potion sellers, secret writers, and part-time magicians. They did well in the cracks of Roman society, serving those who preferred quiet power to open force. Not all. Attempts worked, of course. Some potions made people sick. Others did nothing at all. But when they failed, it was rarely the recipe that was blamed. Instead, people believed the victim had been cursed or was protected by stronger magic. This belief kept the cycle going. It gave customers hope and gave sellers business. Faith in the unseen was part of the formula. Among the upper class, such practices were not only allowed but expected. At rich parties, unusual dishes were laced with substances believed to stir desire. Dancers wore oils soaked with stimulating herbs. Perfumes were chosen not for smell alone, but for their supposed effect on desire. Even bedroom decoration was influenced by beliefs in erotic energy. Statues, carvings, and wall paintings often included references to fertility gods or scenes of happy union. It was not all romantic. Some potions were made for force. They were slipped to servants, rivals, or even political targets. In rare cases, aphrodisiacs were used to create a scandal. A senator made foolish by love could be manipulated, blackmailed, or removed. These darker uses were risky, but not unusual. The line between passion and power was thin, and Roman citizens crossed it often. What is perhaps most telling is how normal it all was. These practices were not limited to outcasts or the desperate. They were common. Recipes were found on walls, written in family cookbooks, and passed from mother to daughter. Love, after all, was a dangerous thing. The Romans simply tried to give themselves an advantage, whether through flowers or fluids. I find it fascinating that beneath all their laws and rituals, the Romans still turned to bat blood for relationship advice. It shows just how little has changed in some ways. We still search for control over something as unpredictable as love. The methods are cleaner now, but the reasons remain familiar. As we follow the Roman obsession with control deeper, we begin to see how even punishment was tied to sexual humiliation. In the next part, we will look at how nudity, public shame, and attack were used as tools of control dressed up as fairness. If desire could be managed with herbs and chants, then power could be enforced through belief. In ancient Rome, the meeting point between religion and intimacy created an unclear space where boundaries became increasingly blurred. While certain rituals were symbolic, others went far beyond gestures. Intimate acts hidden as religious offerings or divine rites became a disturbing part of specific groups and secret cults. These were not isolated oddities. In some circles they were accepted, even respected. One of the most unsettling parts of Roman religious life was how easily sexual violence could be reframed as spiritual duty. Within a handful of mystery cults, acts of forced closeness were not only allowed, but built into ritual. Some temples were known to host sacred unions where women, often young and lower class, were expected to give in. As part of ceremonial offerings, these acts were wrapped in mythical language, calling on gods of fertility or chaos. But for the victims, it was simply abuse with a divine stamp. There were groups that pushed the idea of symbolic death and rebirth through physical surrender. The problem arose when the line between willing participation and force disappeared. Those in positions of authority, priests, fortune tellers, even rich people funding the temple had access and protection.
Their actions were protected by the frame of belief. They could claim the gods required it. And once that excuse was made, there was little room for resistance. Some rituals involved new members being brought into dark rooms, blindfolded, surrounded by incense and chanting. What began as a spiritual preparation ended with acts that today would be seen as clear violations. But without written promises and with religion holding huge influence, those who suffered rarely spoke out. Even if they did, their voices carried little weight. Power structures leaned heavily in favor of those leading the rites. It is horrifying how easily divine inspiration can be used as an excuse to avoid punishment. That is true across history, but Rome made it almost official. Some temples even had written rules excusing divine union, especially when calling on fertility gods like Liber, Bacchus, or Venus. Celebrations often turned into frenzies where wine, music, and bodies blurred all moral lines. The Bacchanalia festivals, for instance, became known for their wild sexual displays. These events, first meant to honor Bacchus, god of wine and ecstasy, soon gained a name for excess. Men and women of all classes mixed, sometimes masked, often drunk. Within this fog, acts of control and use were hard to separate from celebration. Roman authorities did try to stop these gatherings at times, citing moral decay, but the pull was too strong. Pleasure, when joined with divine permission, became nearly impossible to contain. The idea of intimacy as sacrifice was not always violent, but it was frequently unequal. Those offering themselves were told it was noble, that the gods favored their surrender. Yet, the ones receiving those offerings were rarely low in status. They were not equals meeting in spiritual union. They were powerful men, receiving what they felt entitled to, wrapped in robes and incense instead of armor and sword. Compared to today's so-called wellness groups, the Romans were basically running adult theme parks with a priest on the payroll. The rituals often had theatrical elements, torches, chanting, flowers, and even animal masks. But at the core was the same old story, someone with power convincing someone without it that suffering was meaningful. What makes these practices especially troubling is the way victims were made invisible. They were not always named in records. Often they were called the offering, the vessel, or simply not mentioned at all. The words used stripped them of humanity. It turned them into parts of a script, necessary props in someone else's performance. And because it was written down by those in charge, that story stayed main for centuries. Even when Rome changed to Christianity, echoes of this pattern continued. Some early Christian groups condemned sexual excess while quietly repeating power abuses under different names. The shift was less about protecting the weak and more about changing who held the authority to define what was holy. It is hard not to notice that the costumes changed more than the behavior. There are accounts, rare but disturbing, of children being involved in temple rituals. Whether real or stretched, they point to a society where protection was not guaranteed by youth or innocence. In a culture obsessed with rank, purity could be used just as easily as strength, and when challenged, wrongdoers could hide behind their status. High priests, senators, and even emperors often escaped blame. In one famous scandal, members of a cult dedicated to a foreign goddess were accused of using their rituals as covers for orgies, sacrifices, and even murder. The Senate looked into it and banned the group, but not before years of unchecked activity. It is telling that the action only came after political pressure, not moral anger. Rome was practical, not caring. I find it disturbing how silence was baked into the ritual. Victims were trained not to question, not to accuse, and definitely not to resist. In some ways, that is more dangerous than open violence. It creates a culture where harm is normal and passed off as destiny. While these examples do not reflect every Roman religious practice, they do highlight a darker side of Roman spirituality, one where belief and power work together to excuse anything. Sexual crimes, when hidden by incense and Latin prayers, were less likely to be looked at, and so they continued unchallenged for generations. In the next part, we will explore another shadowed layer of Roman culture, how public punishment often included sexual shaming. Whether carved into stone or carried out in the square, shame was used like a blade, cutting deeper than chains ever could. While temples offered spiritual excuse for sexual use, the amphitheater provided a more direct show. In ancient Rome, not all contests involved swords and shields. Some involved nothing more than naked bodies and an audience hungry for excitement. Intimacy in certain public places was not only allowed, it was performed, measured, bet upon, and celebrated with the same energy as horse races or gladiator fights. Among the more disturbing practices that grew under the Roman appetite for show were sexual contests, often involving servants. These were not sudden events. They were organized, timed, and at times announced alongside traditional shows. Men and women, typically chosen from the enslaved population, were forced to take part in intimate acts for the amusement of the crowd. Their performance was judged, cheered, and sometimes even scored like a sport. It was not unusual for a particularly attractive servant to be trained not for housework or field labor, but for sexual display. These individuals were taught endurance, rhythm, and seductive techniques, as if learning a formal skill. They were dressed in fancy but easily removed clothing, walked before the audience, and then told to perform. The more creative, energetic, or shocking the act, the more praise they earned. Sometimes there were multiple rounds, sometimes a single big show. Either way, the event turned private closeness into strange entertainment. Only the Romans could turn humiliation into a group hobby and still call it culture. While other societies might have hidden such desires behind closed doors, Rome allowed them to happen in public, framed as a test of stamina or virility. Audience members placed bets on which performer would last longer or give more satisfaction to a chosen partner. Bets were taken openly, and prize money collected by the owners was part of the draw. Some of these contests included famous gladiators. These men, already raised to near celebrity status by their fights in the arena, were also sometimes expected to satisfy wealthy Roman women or serve as guests in sexually charged events. Their bodies, hard from training and marked with scars, were seen as both tools of violence and objects of desire. Some were rented out for private events. Others were put into staged contests where their physicality was tested in more personal ways. The practice blurred the lines between human and product in deeply unsettling ways. These individuals had no choice in the matter. They were possessions being used to excite, and the more skilled they were, the more often they were chosen. The audience rarely considered what it meant to be on that stage, stripped of dignity, and used as a form of weekend fun. There are recorded cases of whole houses of pleasure being temporarily moved into amphitheaters for special events. The stage would be set, torches lit, and music played as the contest began. Crowd reactions could be loud, rowdy, and sometimes cruel. Winners might be walked around like champions. Losers were often made fun of or punished. In extreme cases, failure to satisfy could even lead to death, especially if the act was part of a larger public ritual or punishment. It is hard not to compare this to modern reality shows, except with far higher stakes and absolutely no agreement. The crowd's obsession with watching others in weak positions has not disappeared. It has only changed. What Rome did in stone arenas, others now watch through screens. There is some evidence to suggest that these sexual performances also had religious elements mixed in. In certain festivals, particularly those honoring fertility gods, sex contests were seen as copies of divine pairing. The winners were thought to carry luck, virility, or divine favor, and were sometimes even given symbolic roles in the festival's closing rites, but at the core it was still used wrapped in sacred language. The role of women in these performances varied. Female servants were also forced to compete in sexual endurance or performance contests. Sometimes they were paired with many partners. Sometimes they were used to humiliate prisoners, soldiers, or even condemned criminals. The point was never shared pleasure. It was performance under pressure, directed by others and consumed by strangers. It leaves a bitter taste to think about how bodies were treated as tools for fun without the slightest care for freedom. There was no choice, no exit, and no audience sympathy. These contests were as normal as any other form of Roman fun, and their cruelty was simply another part of the empire's appetite for control. In wealthy Roman homes, private versions of these contests also took place. Rich patrons might host sex games at parties, inviting guests to judge, score, or even join in. Performers again had no say. These parties were often masked, oiled with heavy wine, and carried on deep into the night. The next morning, all that remained were rumors, and rumors were rarely kind to the ones forced to perform. Rome's legal system, built to protect property above all else, offered no help. A servant's complaint was meaningless. Even free people, if caught up in such games through force or blackmail, had little chance of fairness. Honor in this context belonged only to those with citizenship, wealth, and status. Everyone else was there to serve, and in this case the service was bodily. Eventually, as Christian influence spread, some of these shows were officially banned. But habits rooted in fun and power were not so easily erased. Versions of these practices continued in more private settings, hidden from the new moral codes, but still echoing the same logic that desire, when mixed with control, could be made into sport. In the next part, we turn to the bedrooms of emperors themselves, where excess reached new heights. There, personal pleasure became imperial policy, and the line between ruler and predator blurred completely.
After the shouting faded in the arena and the masks came off at the drunken parties, Rome still found ways to carry its fascinations back into the home. Not through hidden scrolls or secret whispers, but directly onto the dishes, cups, and everyday pottery of life. For many Romans, erotic images were not something tucked away in the shadows. They were something they ate off of, drank from, and showed proudly on shelves and walls. Erotic scenes were painted in careful detail on clay vases, bronze trays, and even oil lamps. These were not simplified or symbolic pictures. They were clear, unapologetically realistic, and often shown in a series like instruction panels. One cup might show a couple in one pose. Another cup on the same table would show the next. A dinner guest passing a jug of wine might suddenly come face to face with a pair of tangled bodies frozen in mid-motion. It was casual, it was normal, and it was very Roman. Craftsmen did not seem to consider any act too private for public display. Heterosexual, homosexual, group activity, even the inclusion of mythical creatures or exaggerated shapes. Nothing was off limits. These were not shocking to the average Roman diner. On the contrary, such images were a mark of sophistication, wit, and even cultural awareness. They suggested that the host was worldly, educated, and unafraid to enjoy life in all its forms. Only in Rome could you eat olives out of a bowl decorated like a wild party and call it good taste. It was not satire. It was not pornography in the way modern minds might see it. To the Romans, it was simply part of the texture of life. Beauty and pleasure were not separate areas. They could overlap on a wine pitcher without anyone blinking. Many surviving pieces come from places like Pompeii and Herculaneum, where ash kept even the most. Delicate designs. In some households, dining sets were clearly chosen to match the theme of rest and indulgence. The host could set a table with all items showing different acts, like a tour of human passion made in clay. Some plates were divided into sections, each featuring a different pose, suggesting not only visual appeal, but also a hint of teaching use. These items were not necessarily saved for houses of pleasure or wild parties. They showed up in private homes, bathhouses, and sometimes even inns. It was not about exciting guests so much as setting a mood. The Romans liked to mix talk with philosophy, drink with poetry, and intimacy with art. The boundaries were deliberately blurred. What modern minds might consider rude or improper, Roman hosts saw as refined and cultured. If a modern dinner party featured similar tableware, it would likely go viral, and not for its historical correctness. Today's society often draws sharp lines between the erotic and the artistic. Rome had no such lines, or if it did, they were easily crossed with a laugh and another cup of wine. It speaks to a basic difference in how they viewed the body, pleasure, and the role of visual culture in daily life. It was not only pottery. Erotic scenes were carved into furniture, scratched into wall paintings, and even included in floor mosaics. Some bedrooms had walls covered in sequences of acts almost like storyboards. Public baths had changing rooms with tile work showing couples in graphic poses. Even oil lamps, objects linked with quiet home moments, might feature lovers mid-embrace as their design. In other words, closeness was never meant to be hidden. It was part of the artistic fabric of the home. Many of these objects show a remarkable attention to physical detail, muscles, curves, and facial expressions, all shown with a level of body knowledge that suggests familiarity and comfort with the human form. Some pieces border on the funny with exaggerated features or playful compositions. Others are direct, showing pleasure without disguise. It was life. You start to realize that for the Romans, eroticism was not a private treat, but a public language. Just like poetry or dance, it could be discussed, shown, and appreciated in many forms. There was no sharp moral line, only context. A nude statue in a temple could exist with a cheeky goblet in the kitchen. Both were valid expressions of human experience. This cultural openness did not mean everyone was equally free to express themselves. As always, class and gender decided who made the art, who bought it, and how it was understood. Most craftsmen were lower-class workers making things for the wealthy. The images served wealthy tastes, often reinforcing the same power patterns that played out in real bedrooms. Male control, female availability, and the casual objectification of enslaved bodies were common themes. Still, there was detail. Some pieces subtly reversed roles with women, taking the lead or male figures shown in more vulnerable positions. These were not acts of rebellion, but reflections of Rome's complex sexual imagination. Power could be performed in many ways, and sometimes even the suggestion of reversal was a form of erotic thrill. Today, museums often have to decide how much of this material to show. Some items remain locked in private collections or limited rooms. Others are placed behind cloudy glass with warning labels. But in ancient Rome, no such filters existed.
A child could grow up seeing these images every day, learning about life and pleasure not from abstract stories, but from the dinner plates themselves. In this way, Rome's obsession with erotic art was never only about excitement. It was about creating a mood, one where pleasure, beauty, and humor were allowed to exist together. One where the body was not only a subject of desire, but of skill. Even today, the surviving pottery pieces still tell stories. Stories that speak not only to Roman desire, but to their belief that intimacy belonged at the table alongside wine, talk, and laughter. Next, we turn to a more unsettling use of bodies in the Roman world, where desire, violence, and faith met under the name of punishment. Some Roman masters did not only see their servants as tools for work or bodies for pleasure. For some, the use of a servant only ended when the servant did. After a night of fun, certain wealthy people treated their captives not as people, but as objects with an end date. These were not rare stories whispered in alleys. They were patterns repeated and recorded by those bold enough to write them down. Some texts described noblemen who used their sexual servants for a single night, only to throw them away the next morning like spoiled food. The throwing away was not quiet or hidden. Bodies were sometimes left on the side of the road, left to rot in the sun without burial, without a name, without a second thought. The Roman legal system did not. Consider this murder. Servants were property. If you broke a chair, no one called it a crime. The same thinking applied to human beings. A man could beat, starve, or even kill his servant without punishment so long as the act did not disturb public order. That was the line. Not morality, not caring, just visibility. If no one complained, the law stayed quiet. It is disturbing to realize that in some Roman households, what followed a night of intimacy was not sleep, but death. It was not always about anger or jealousy. Sometimes it was a ritual, the idea that power reached its peak only when it ended in destruction. To control someone so fully that you decided not only how they lived, but whether they continued to exist. That was the fantasy for certain Roman elites. The act of throwing away a used servant became a final stamp of control, a way to show the household, the neighbors, and sometimes even guests that this man held absolute power over another life. This behavior was not a secret. Writers like Juvenal and Seneca mentioned such excesses. Satirists made fun of them. Philosophers condemned them. But the practice continued. The show of cruelty became part of the social theater. Guests might laugh or look away, but they rarely stepped in. In some cases, these deaths happened as part of larger events. Parties that ended in violence where laughter turned into screams and no one left the room clean. Servants had no protection. A female servant might be passed from one man to another during a dinner, then strangled by the last because she had displeased him. A male companion might be killed for being too quiet, too loud, or simply no longer amusing. These were not crimes. They were personal choices made in private homes that no court bothered to question. In modern terms, it is like throwing away a human being because the wine was not sweet enough, and the comparison is not too strong. Some masters did kill for small reasons. A wrinkle in a sheet, a bite mark, a refusal to smile. When a servant was valued only for short-term pleasure, there was no room for mercy. What made it worse was the show that often followed. Bodies were sometimes placed at crossroads or near fountains where others could see and be reminded. It was not only disposal, it was a message. Power, after all, only means something if others see it. Leaving the body out in public was not only carelessness, it was part of the control. A show of authority so twisted that even the aftermath became part of the performance. Servants could not refuse intimacy, but they also could not refuse death. That double trap made their situation especially cruel. Even those who pleased their masters lived under constant threat. A good night did not guarantee a tomorrow. Some were kept alive only because their master had not yet tired of them. Others were rewarded with better food or softer bedding, only to be killed when they asked for more. The ups and downs were part of the terror. No rules, only moods. The more you read about these practices, the more you realized that Roman power was obsessed with show, even in its darkest forms. It was not enough to control. They needed to show the result, and the sexual area was where this obsession played out with the fewest limits. The body of a servant was the blank page for a master's appetite, and when the art was done, the page was burned. This culture of post-use cruelty did not reach every household. There were masters who treated their servants with some kindness. But among the powerful, among those who could get away with more, excess was often the point. The greater the show of disrespect for life, the more untouchable a man appeared. It was a harsh equation, but it worked in a society where how you were seen shaped your name more than fairness did. The city itself showed this contradiction. Rome, with its grand temples and public squares, also held alleys that smelled of rotting flesh. People might pass by a throne, a way body, and simply cover their nose. A servant's death did not bring sadness. It brought shrugs. The body of a servant seller, doubly devalued, drew even less attention. Their lives ended in silence. Their names are lost. Their suffering was absorbed into the dust of the empire. There were no gravestones, no funerals, no goodbyes, only a body and a stain. Sometimes not even that. Animals might drag the body away before morning. Children might poke it with sticks. The world moved on. The master might host another dinner that night. A new servant might be brought in, wide-eyed and unaware of what had happened to the one who came before. It is hard not to feel that behind the glory of Rome, beneath the marble and the speeches, there was a hunger that ate without regret. And the people it ate most easily were the ones least able to speak. They were the ones who never had a choice, who were used, thrown away, and forgotten. In the next part, we will step into the final chapter of Roman. Sexual cruelty, where the body became more than a plaything. It became a weapon, a message, a punishment, and in the end, a political tool. The evidence of Rome's obsession with intimacy did not vanish with the fall of the empire. Much of it survived, set in walls, carved into furniture, painted across pottery and kept under layers of ash. Pompeii and Herculaneum are often treated as archaeological wonders, but what they truly keep is the bluntness of Roman desire. When the ash of Mount Vesuvius froze life in place, it also froze the casual acceptance of erotic art in homes, inns, and public walls. Uncovered mosaics show acts so clear that museums have argued for years how to display them. Some wall paintings were so bold that they were locked away in so-called secret rooms for decades, hidden from the public and only open to scholars. The ancient Romans had placed these same images above their beds, beside their baths, and over their dining tables. To them, intimacy was not an act to. It was a part of life's rhythm, a theme suitable for everyday decoration. Their open showing was not only an artistic choice, it reflected a culture where sexuality was a social performance, a religious act, and a political tool all at once. These attitudes did not disappear with time. Instead, they echoed quietly through history, coming back in curious places. During the Renaissance, when Europe claimed to rediscover classical values, many artists and thinkers looked to Rome for inspiration. And what they found was not only law, building, or thought. They also found the openness of Roman eroticism. Renaissance nobles collected Roman sex art. Writers translated and retold ancient erotic poems. Even the idea of using the body to show status and desire found new life in paintings and statues. It is a little ironic that the same culture that inspired great churches also inspired manuals on how to flirt like a Roman. In more subtle ways, modern sexuality has inherited Rome's complicated view of control, shame, and image. Today's obsession with reputation, with the carefully shown self, is not that different from Roman ideals. Back then, a man's sexual conduct was tied to his identity in public life. Today, a single scandal can still end a career. The stakes remain high. Only the settings have changed. We no longer carve our names into stone, but we scroll past them on screens. Even the more specific sexual practices of Rome have left their traces. Binding, role play, and showing off all have echoes in ancient Roman rituals, performances, and private lives. Some of the more detailed Roman sex guides gave careful advice on posture, technique, and mood. They offer tips for lasting longer, impressing one's lover, and even pleasing many partners at once. If that sounds like a modern lifestyle magazine, it is because much of what we think of as new is just Rome showing up in different clothes. The most striking gift, however, is not in technique, but in mindset. Rome taught the world that intimacy can be a ladder. It can be used to decide who is in power and who is beneath. That gift is harder to shake. It stays in attitudes about manhood, in laws that still watch certain bodies more than others, and in the idea that pleasure needs permission. Roman men believed they had the right to take what they wanted, provided the partner had less status. That calculation of power has come back across centuries, often dressed up as tradition or morality. Of course, history also twists what it remembers. The Roman Empire was not a single-minded orgy. It had variety, contradiction, and change. Some emperors tried to encourage stricter sexual behavior. Others leaned into public excess. Some citizens resisted the open sexuality around them. Others took part in it quietly behind closed doors. What we know comes mostly from powerful voices, poets, historians, sculptors. We do not hear much from the servants, sellers, or ordinary people whose bodies. We used to build Rome's erotic image, but what we do have, the ruins, the objects, the records, shows us a culture both proud and worried. The Romans celebrated their appetite, but they were also terrified of losing control. That is why they wrote laws to enforce gender roles. That is why they performed manhood so loudly. That is why they turned intimacy into politics, into gossip, into theater. For them, intimacy was never only about pleasure. It was a currency. and like all currencies it had winners and losers. It is wild to think that the same empire that built waterways and roads also built houses of pleasure on every corner. They saw no contradiction in this. Building and excess, discipline and desire went hand in hand. Their temples had both altars and phallic charms. Their military leaders quoted poetry about love. Their household gods stood beside erotic statues. Rome was a place where intimacy was not separated. It spilled into every corner of life. Reading about it now.
One thing becomes clear: empires do not only fall because of enemies at the gate. Sometimes they collapse under the weight of their own excess. That does not mean Roman sexuality caused the empire's fall, but it certainly shows the culture's blind spots. The same confidence that took lands and crushed rebellions also assumed the body could be used without result, that no pleasure was too costly and no act too rich, so long as it confirmed power. Today, tourists walk through Pompeii and Herculaneum in quiet wonder, reading small signs beside crumbling beds and faded paintings. Children look away from certain wall pictures. Some visitors laugh nervously. Others take photos of clay Pemises on kitchen walls, but none of them can deny the bluntness of what the Romans left behind. They did not whisper their desires. They carved them into stone. The sexual history of Rome is not only about shock value, it is about how humans have always struggled with power, image, control, and shame. Ancient Romans were not more twisted than we are. They were just more open about what they believed intimacy could do. That openness makes us uncomfortable, and perhaps it should, because buried beneath the ashen stone is a mirror, and sometimes when we stare into it, we see more of ourselves than we expect. So, as we end this journey through the strangest corners of Roman sexuality, take a moment to think not only about what they did, but about how much of it still shapes the way we think about the body, pleasure, and power. Good night, friend. May your sleep be peaceful and your dreams free of Roman bathhouses.